Chapter 1400. This is indeed the forbidden area of the true God Sword sect. If I kill my way in, I might be able to obtain the inheritance of the true God Sword sect. Grand Sword Saint Merlin's eyes flashed with murderous intent. The silver edge of the sword in his hand flowed like water, and was as cold as ice. Sword light flashed explosively as the sword struck. Like a dense rainstorm, it tore apart the enemies in front and made them disappear. But soon, more enemies appeared. These enemies were in the form of black shadows and held black swords in their hands. Their swords were different in length, width, and thickness, and they were all different. Their bodies emitted shockingly sharp fluctuations, and they were extremely pure, capable of killing all invaders. This black shadow was like a sword cultivator's obsession, guarding the forbidden area of the true God Sword sect. Merlin had already forgotten how many black shadows he had killed. He only knew that he was constantly fighting, killing, and advancing. Similar to Merlin's situation, the other two Grand Sword Saints also encountered the same thing. They kept bumping into the shadows and kept fighting fiercely with the shadows. They kept killing the shadows as if there was no end to it. The black-robed man who entered last was also like the three Grand Sword Saints, constantly encountering sword-wielding black shadows. This black-robed man's hands were empty, but he wielded a variety of strange spells. They were powerful and constantly shattered the black shadows. Then, he formed a seal with both hands, and a black vortex appeared beside him. Two figures walked out from it. They were two humans. These two humans had slightly dark skin and listless eyes. Their bodies were very strong, and there were no signs of life on them. If Chu Mu saw them, he would definitely recognize that this black-robed man was from the underworld god tribe. The four of them did not have the Sword Sect Spirit Seal, which was equivalent to entering the forbidden area of the true God Sword sect without permission. They would be surrounded by the Black Shadow Swordsmen of the forbidden area. If they could resist the Black Shadow Swordsmen's siege and advance, they might eventually reach the depths of the forbidden area. However, that hope was too slim. As the forbidden area of the true God Sword sect, it was filled with danger and countless seals. Even a high-level saint-level contender would not be able to gain any benefit. There were 11,350 sword steels in the forest of 10,000 sword steels. They stood on the ground one by one, forming a forest of steels in an orderly manner. Every sword steel emitted a shocking aura that was cold and sharp. The sword steel was divided into 4 levels. The lowest level was 2 meters tall, the middle level was 3 meters tall, the high level was 5 meters tall, and the highest level was 9 meters tall. Chu Mu held his sword and stood in front of a 2-meter-long sword steel. This was the 18th sword steel that he had comprehended. Chu Mu's unfathomable comprehension ability and exceedingly high level of swordsmanship allowed him to have an extremely good starting point. Easily, in less than 15 minutes, he would be able to comprehend the essence of the swordsmanship on the low-level sword steel and then master it. Chu Mu's goal was not to learn the swordsmanship and use it to battle. He only wanted to expand his swordsmanship foundation and deepen his accumulation. Therefore, he did not care if he was proficient in the moves or not. As long as he could grasp the essence of the swordsmanship and understand the meaning of the swordsmanship, it would be enough. Day after day passed. Chu Mu rapidly comprehended one sword steel after another, continuously grasping the essence and meaning of the swordsmanship recorded on the sword steel. The swordsmanship on the sword steel was not all complete. Some were a whole set, some only had 2 or 3 moves, and some only had 1 move. Some swordsmanship was suitable for battle, and some swordsmanship was not suitable for battle, but suitable for cultivation. Chu Mu cultivated the eternal sword momentum and comprehended the sword of heaven and earth. As a general, it would be easier for him to comprehend the essence and then master it. As Chu Mu's comprehension deepened, under the accumulation and expansion, when he comprehended other sword steels and swordsmanship, it would play a supporting role to a certain extent. 19 sword steals, 20 sword steals, 99th sword steal, 100th sword steal. Bai Ling roamed freely within the forbidden grounds as if she was revisiting an old place. There were 11,350 sword steals. Low-grade sword steals were the most, with 7,500. Middle-grade sword steals were second, with 3,500. High-grade sword steals were 320. Top-grade sword steals were the least, with only 30. Chu Mu's goal in entering the forbidden grounds of the True God Sword Sect was to grasp the final inheritance. However, he had to pass the test. Comprehending the swordsmanship in the forest of 10,000 sword steals was the test content. First, comprehend the forest of 10,000 sword steals and combine it with one's own swordsmanship. Then, create a sword steel that was recognized by the forest of 10,000 sword steals. No matter if it was a low-grade, middle-grade, high-grade, or top-grade sword steel, it would be considered as passing the test and would be sent to the final place of inheritance. Creating one's own swordsmanship was not difficult. However, it was not easy at all. However, to create a swordsmanship that was recognized by the forest of 10,000 sword steels, it could only be described as extremely difficult. Even the swordsmanship on the low-grade sword steel was something that many swordsmen could not create in their lifetime. However, to a true genius, creating a profound swordsmanship only required time and accumulation. When the accumulation was sufficient and there was an opportunity, they would be able to create it naturally. Chu Mu had talent and comprehension. What he lacked was accumulation. This was because he wanted to create a swordsmanship that was more suitable for himself. He did not want to create any random swordsmanship. This was because every time he created, it would consume his own accumulation. Once it was consumed, he would have to replenish it. Only after enriching himself could he create another one. If he did not do it, then so be it. If he wanted to do it, then he would do it to the best of his ability. The swordsmanship on the low-grade sword steel was not difficult for Chu Mu to comprehend. It was easy for him to grasp it quickly. However, Chu Mu did not miss out on it. Although some of the swordsmanship were close to similar, there were still differences between the swordsmanship created by different people. The difference was that each outstanding swordsman had a unique understanding of swordsmanship. After that, the 3 sword saints of the human race, and the god of Underworld clan, who had entered the forbidden area of the True God Sword Sect, were still constantly besieged by the Black Shadow Sword Guard. They were still fighting fiercely, killing and advancing. It was as if there was no end to the road. They were shocked to find that the Black Shadow Sword Guards were endless. They killed one after another. As they continued to fight, their strength was constantly consumed. They had no choice but to use pills to replenish their strength. Chu Mu was immersed in comprehending the forest of 10,000 sword steels. He was immersed in the sea of swordsmanship. He was like a huge dry sponge, crazily absorbing water. That water was one swordsmanship after another. There were offensive swordsmanship, defensive swordsmanship, auxiliary swordsmanship, cultivation swordsmanship. There were all kinds of swordsmanship that were constantly expanding and enriching, perfecting Chu Mu's knowledge and accumulation of swordsmanship. He was like a fish swimming freely in the sea of swordsmanship. Every swordsmanship contained a trace of Tao. Stab, cut, hack, slash, point, collapse, every basic swordsmanship could evolve into countless swordsmanship. After comprehending the 1368th sword steel, Chu Mu's eyes shone with a profound light. The sword saints of the 5 spirits had rich experience in swordsmanship. All of it was transmitted into Chu Mu's mind and stored. As Chu Mu cultivated and comprehended, he absorbed it bit by bit. Previously, he had already absorbed most of it. Now, after comprehending the low-level sword steels, he had completely absorbed it. The sword saints of the 5 spirits were indeed amazing, but they could not be compared to the many amazing sword cultivators of the True God Sword Sect. He did not know fatigue, nor did he know boredom. He only comprehended, and comprehended again and again. He had finished comprehending the 7,500th sword steel. This was the last low-level sword steel. After comprehending all the low-level sword steels, Chu Mu did not immediately start comprehending the mid-level sword steel. Instead, he sat down cross-legged and felt that there were countless sword shadows in his mind. Each sword shadow represented the swordsmanship of a sword steel. The 7,500th sword shadow circled around in his mind. Chu Mu focused his mind and focused on the sword shadows, carefully feeling them. One after another, the sword shadows represented the swordsmanship. Some of them were similar, while some were different. Chu Mu was sorting and straightening them out. He extracted the essence of the similar swordsmanship and fused them together to form a more complete and comprehensive swordsmanship. For example, two swordsmanship that were similar but had slight differences. This difference could be that one swordsmanship focused on speed, while the other focused on strength. By extracting the essence of these two swordsmanship and fusing them together, one would be able to balance both strength and speed, making it more perfect. This process was more difficult than comprehending the low-level sword steels. However, with Chu Mu's own foundation and ability, it was still very fast. As time passed, the sword shadows in his mind fused in 2s, 3s, or even more. After 3 days, the number of sword shadows in his mind had greatly decreased. It was not even half of the original number. 1,300 sword images. This was formed from the fusion of 7,500 sword images. It represented that after Chu Mu had comprehended the essence of the 7,500 low-ranking sword steels, he had fused it with his own understanding. After painstakingly unraveling it, he had finally fused it together. It also represented the expansion of his sword technique accumulation and the increase of his sword technique attainment. The 1,300th sword shadow was already the limit. Chu Mu felt that even if he continued to comprehend, there would not be much progress. In other words, he had to start comprehending the mid-level sword steel. It was obvious that the sword skills on the mid-level sword steel were more profound than those on the low-level sword steel. Chu Mu chose to comprehend the sword skill on the mid-level sword steel. It was called One Sword in the Clouds, and it only had one move. Holding the sky beheading sword in the clouds, Shao Qun stood in front of the mid-level sword steel. He stared at the sword steel without blinking. The patterns on the sword steel were as if they were about to form a brand and be engraved into his mind. The move of One Sword in the Clouds was quickly grasped by Chu Mu. Suddenly, Chu Mu's hand moved and the sky beheading sword flew out. It was as if it was pulling a cloud over. It was mysterious and unpredictable, and its trajectory was difficult to find. Shao Qun walked with the sword, his body followed the sword, and his sword followed his will. His essence, qi, and soul merged as one, using the sword intent to control and the sword in his heart to control. The mid-level sword steel's One Sword in the Clouds was quickly grasped by Chu Mu. This sword was similar to one of the 1,300th sword shadow in Chu Mu's mind. That sword shadow was the result of the fusion, and it was called the White Cloud style. Chapter 1401. In front of an intermediate sword steel, a figure was dancing with a sword. The trajectory of each sword was clearly visible and unpredictable. Sword light danced and the sword shadows were unparalleled. Chu Mu spent a total of 15 days comprehending the low-rank sword steel and merging the sword images. Chu Mu spent a total of 3,500 pieces of middle-rank sword steels. There was a similarity between these middle-rank sword steels and the sword arts on the low-rank sword steels. These middle-rank sword arts were similar to each other. Comprehending these sword arts would be even faster. About 15 days later, Chu Mu successfully comprehended the sword techniques on the 3,500 intermediate sword steels. In his mind, there were 3,500 sword shadows in addition to the original 1,300 sword shadows. Chu Mu was not disturbed by the original 1,300 sword shadows. He focused on the 3,500 sword shadows, removing the impurities and extracting the essence. Then, he fused the similar sword techniques and perfected them. The 3,500 sword shadows eventually fused into 780 sword shadows. Chu Mu did not stop and continued to comprehend. He fused the 780 sword shadows with the original 1,300 sword shadows because the essence and profoundness contained in these sword shadows were somewhat similar. Similarities meant that there was an entry point and a point of convergence. There was a possibility of fusion. After fusion, it might not necessarily be more powerful, but it would be more perfect. Chu Mu spent a lot of time in this process. In the end, there were still 850 sword shadows left in his mind. Then, he immediately immersed himself in comprehending the advanced sword steels. There were 320 advanced sword steels, which was far less than the beginner and intermediate sword steels. However, the sword techniques recorded on the advanced sword steels were far more profound than those on the beginner and intermediate sword steels. The sword technique recorded on the first advanced sword steel that Chu Mu comprehended was called the Radiance Sword. The Radiance Sword was dazzling. It was magnificent and powerful. The divine light intent in Chu Mu's spiritual world was drawn in and shone brightly. Starting from the Radiance Sword, Chu Mu began to encounter difficulties in his comprehension. He was no longer as carefree as when he was comprehending the low and middle-grade sword steels. The sword techniques recorded on the high-grade sword steel were extremely profound. Every single one of them was the painstaking work of a sword cultivator. They were not something that the previous sword techniques could compare to. This was also the reason why there was such a huge disparity between the low-grade and mid-grade sword technique. The light on the heaven/sword gradually condensed, becoming increasingly intense and dazzling. He casually stabbed out with his sword. The light condensed into a single line. The sword light burned fiercely, repelling the darkness and burning all evil. This was a grand and imposing sword technique. If Xia Zhenkong saw this, he would definitely be wild with joy. He would be willing to pay a huge price to exchange for it. Some of the sword techniques in the forest of 10,000 sword steels focused on the form. For example, the 13 Philian styles explained the essence of thrusting. If one wanted to unleash its true power, one had to use thrusts, slashes, and other sword techniques. Some sword techniques focused on intent. For example, the Radiance Sword emphasized the magnificent intent of the light. As long as one grasped the intent and released it, it could be used to slash, stab, or sweep. Form and intent were high and low. Each had their own unique points. However, from form to intent, it was a sublimation from the low to the high. With the help of the divine light intent, Chu Mu spent half a day to grasp the essence of the Radiant Sword. If he was allowed to comprehend the sword techniques on the high-grade sword steel from the beginning, he might not even be able to comprehend it in a few days, let alone half a day. Starting from the low-grade sword steel, it was a gradual process. Comprehending all of them gave Chu Mu an excellent accumulation. After that, he would fuse them together and sublimate himself. Then, he would reach the mid-grade sword steel, then the high-grade sword steel. He would advance step by step in an orderly manner. After grasping the essence of the Radiance Sword, another sword shadow appeared in his mind. The sword shadow radiated light in all directions. It was extremely powerful and overshadowed the light of the other sword shadows. It was as if it was above all. After taking a deep breath, Chu Mu began to walk towards the second high-grade sword steel. With Chu Mu's comprehension and accumulation, the speed of comprehension of the 320 sword steels continued to increase. Originally, he could only comprehend 3 sword steels a day. Now it increased to 5 sword steels a day, and then to 7 sword steals a day. However, this speed was still a far cry from the hundreds of sword steals a day that he could comprehend in the low-grade sword steals. The first high-grade sword steal, Radiance Sword, the second high-grade sword steal, Passing Water Sword, the third high-grade sword steal, the 180th high-grade sword steal, Unparalleled Sword Style. The more he comprehended, the more he felt the profoundness of the sword technique. It was as deep as the ocean and as boundless as the universe. There was no beginning and no end. When he finished comprehending the 320 high-grade sword steals, Chu Mu stopped. This time, it was different from before. He only felt that his mind was filled with a lot of information. Sword shadows surged and the sword light was awe-inspiring. The sword techniques on the high-grade sword steel were much more profound than the low-grade and mid-grade sword technique. If the high-grade sword techniques were like this, then what about the top-grade sword technique? Now, he had no time to care about the top-grade sword technique. His entire mind was filled with information and he had to absorb it as soon as possible. He sat down cross-legged and removed all distracting thoughts. He started to comprehend and absorb. His body was surrounded by circles of sword aura. It was formless and colorless, but it was extremely sharp. Bai Ling's figure appeared in a flash. She stood in midair and looked at Chu Mu. Then, she looked at the sword steels around her and revealed a gratified smile. The true God Sword sect could be considered to have a successor. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, as time passed, the number of sword shadows in his mind decreased. After the combination of the low-grade and mid-grade sword steels, there were 850 sword shadows. After comprehending the high-grade sword steel, there were 320 sword shadows. Because of comprehending the high-grade sword steel, he had a deeper understanding of the previous sword technique. The 850 sword shadows were continuously fused and finally became 530 sword shadows. The 530 sword shadows began to fuse with the 320 sword shadows. In the end, there were 460 sword shadows left. Every sword shadow emitted a sparkling and translucent light. They were extremely sharp and could not move at all in his mind. "I'm finally done comprehending." Chu Mu opened his eyes and exhaled. The swelling feeling in his head disappeared. The 460 sword shadows were the result of comprehending over 10,000 sword steels. It was the synthesis of his understanding of sword technique. In the end, there were only 39-meter-tall top-grade sword steels left. On them, there were a total of 30 top-grade sword technique. Top-grade sword techniques were above high-grade sword technique. There were a total of 11,000 sword steels in the forest of 10,000 sword steels. However, there were only 30 top-grade sword steels. One could imagine how difficult it was to create a top-grade sword technique. Chu Mu walked towards the first top-grade sword steel and stood in front of it. The 8th-generation sovereign of the True God Sword sect. It turned out that the sword technique on the first top-grade sword steel was left behind by the 8th-generation sovereign of the True God Sword sect. There was only one move in the sword technique, or rather, one move. This move was called the God-slaying move. God-slaying move. It was a domineering sword technique name. Using the name as an association, one would know that this was a sword technique that was purely for killing. Its power must be extremely terrifying. Taking a deep breath, he immediately entered a state of comprehension. All distracting thoughts were gone, and his mind was clear and bright. When his eyes fell on the lines of the God-slaying move, Chu Mu's pupils suddenly trembled. The sword intent in his spiritual world also shook. It wanted to leave the sword soul and leave the spiritual world. On the top-grade sword steel, there was only one line of the God-slaying move sword technique. It was as if it was formed by a divine sword slashing down. It was as if a peerless sword saint was holding a peerless divine sword. He used everything he had to deduce the essence of the sword and explain the profound of the sword before slashing down from the sky. This sword did not have any gorgeous decorations, nor did it have any complicated technique. It was just a sword slashing down. When it slashed down, it was indomitable. It was a peerless ferocity that killed anyone who stood in its way. Under this sword, anything that stood in its way would be destroyed. Even if a true god was in front of it, it would not hesitate to raise its sword and slash down. God-slaying move, slaying God with a sword. Perhaps this sword could not really slay a god, but it already possessed the courage and decisiveness to swing a sword at a god. This was not something that an ordinary sword cultivator could do. It could be said that the majority of sword cultivators could not do this. The 8th generation sovereign of the true God sword sect. Chumu remembered this person. If the sword cultivators who left their names on the sword steel were said to be extremely talented, then the 8th generation sovereign of the true God sword sect, who left behind the god-slaying move on the top-grade sword steel, was unparalleled. Unparalleled elegance. Chumu had the thought of going back to the past and going back to the same era as the other party to compete. There seemed to be no sharpness, but in fact there was sharpness everywhere. When the sword slashed out, it could slay a god. If it did not die, it would die. There was no room for negotiation. It was decisive and ruthless. Such a person was talented and capable. He was also very ruthless to others and even more ruthless to himself. As these distracting thoughts flashed past, Chumu stabilized the sword intent in his spiritual world. He used the sword intent as a bridge to communicate with the line on the top-grade god-slaying sword steel. It seemed simple, as if someone was holding a sword and slashing it casually. In fact, it was endlessly profound. Unknowingly, Chumu stood up and held the heaven-slaying sword. He slashed out with the sword and tried his best to match the line on the god-slaying sword steel. However, the sword strike that he executed only possessed the form but not the intent behind it. It was equivalent to an empty shell. Chumu was not discouraged. After thinking for a while, he slashed out a second time. Compared to the first slash, there was almost no improvement. He slashed out with the sword again and again. The path of the sword became more and more perfect. It matched the line on the god-slaying sword steel even more. However, it did not have the decisiveness and ruthlessness that one would have when facing a god. After stopping slashing with the sword, Chumu stared at the god-slaying sword steel. His eyes narrowed slightly and radiance shot out in all directions. The god-slaying sword steel was reflected in his eyes. The sword steel seemed to be constantly magnified in front of his eyes. The line on it also seemed to be constantly approaching Chumu. It was as if it had become a sword, a peerless, ferocious sword. It was raised in the hands of an illusory figure and slashed out. It had a perfect path and an unparalleled true meaning. One slash could split the heavens and the earth and kill a true god. Chapter 1402. Major Sect Event. Announcing to the elders, deacons, and disciples of the 6 divine sects that on July 29, 2014, 23:55 a.m., our young sect master has arrived. 6. 8 kilograms, male, mother, and child are safe. Our sect master has become a stay-at-home dad. 30 top-grade sword steels. He had finished comprehending the first steel, the god-slaying sword steel. However, Chumu still felt that he was lacking something. He did not go deep enough. After thinking hard, Chumu had no clue. He put it aside for now and started comprehending the second top-grade sword steel. Soundless sword steel, soundless sword style. The sword technique recorded on the second top-grade sword steel was the soundless sword style. It was mainly used for stabbing, but it could also be used for cutting. It was soundless and unpredictable. It was very lethal. However, in terms of power, the soundless sword style was not as good as the god-slaying sword style. However, it was better in that it was difficult to defend and dodge. Chumu had to fully concentrate on comprehending every top-grade sword steel. The time and energy he used was much more than comprehending high-grade sword steels. It was not comprehending a few steals a day, but one steal every few days. The time required to comprehend the 30 top-grade sword steals was longer than the total time required to comprehend the low-grade, mid-grade, and high-grade sword steals. Similarly, the benefits obtained from comprehending each top-grade sword steal were also greater than the benefits obtained from comprehending the low-grade, mid-grade, and high-grade sword steals. God-slaying sword style, soundless sword style, killing sword style, perfect circle sword style, flying shadow sword style, sky strike sword style, 30 top-grade sword steals, 30 different sword styles. Each sword style represented the painstaking work of a peerless sword cultivator. They all had their own merits, and it was difficult to distinguish between them. The last top-grade sword steel, void sword style. After more than 2 months, Chu Mu finally finished comprehending the 30 top-grade sword steals. From the first low-grade sword steal to the last one, he spent a total of 4 to 5 months. There were 460 sword shadows that had been fused and 30 sword shadows that had not been fused. Chu Mu could not fuse the 30 sword shadows that had not been fused, because each sword shadow represented a peerless sword style. With his current accumulation and ability, he could only comprehend. It was difficult to grasp the essence, let alone fuse them. In the process of comprehending the 30 top-tier sword steals, Chu Mu increasingly understood the profoundness of the sword world and the unparalleled profundity of the eternal sword technique. If it wasn't for these two things, with his superb comprehension and high sword technique realm, he would have to spend at least a few months to get started. Learning a top-tier sword steel for a few months would take at least a few years to comprehend. 30 top-tier sword steals would take Chu Mu at least 100 years. However, Sword Universe and Eternal Sword Technique would greatly shorten this time. Using the Sword Worldly Eternal Sword Momentum to comprehend the sword styles on the 30 top-tier sword steals, at the same time, the sword styles on the 30 top-tier sword steals allowed Chu Mu's comprehension of the Sword Worldly Eternal Sword Momentum to deepen. At this moment, Chu Mu had already forgotten everything else. In his mind and soul, there were only sword shadows. The deeper comprehension of eternal sword style and sword world, and the comprehension of the 30 top-grade sword steals allowed Chu Mu to fuse the 460 sword shadows again. 180 sword shadows. This was Chu Mu's final result. 180 sword shadows. Each of them was better than the sword shadows that he had comprehended from the high-grade sword steals. However, they were inferior to the sword shadows that he had comprehended from the top-grade sword steals. They were in between the two. Chu Mu knew that this was the limit of his comprehension. It was limited by his own accumulation and experience. As he cultivated and time passed, he could fuse them again in the future. Sitting cross-legged in the forest of 10,000 sword steels, Chu Mu recalled the process of his comprehension. He recalled the experience of his growth. Scene after scene flashed through his mind like lightning. In order to be recognized by the forest of 10,000 sword steels, one must create one's own. Erecting a sword steel in the forest of 10,000 sword steels. On the sword steel there could be sword skills, and so on. It did not have to be a sword skill. It was just a general name. When everything came back to him, Chu Mu suddenly asked himself, "What is a sword? What is a sword skill?" He suddenly remembered the process of forging a sword. A sword, at the beginning, was just a piece of metal. After going through high temperatures, fusing and forging step by step, it formed an embryo, which was the so-called sword embryo. The sword embryo was the end of the tempering of the metal block. It was the beginning of becoming a sharp sword. The end and the beginning were both played out on the sword embryo at the same time. Just like now, on the path of self-created swordsmanship, due to various comprehensions, continuous absorption, and continuous accumulation, he had already reached a limit. A limit that he could reach now, and that was the end. After reaching the limit of accumulation, The next step was to use these accumulations and rely on one's own talent and the opportunity of a flash of inspiration to create the most suitable swordsmanship for oneself. That was just a start. After the sword embryo was formed, it went through repeated tempering. It was not a meaningless and random hammering, but the peak of skill. Every hammering was to make the sword embryo more condensed, make the sword embryo more sharp, and make the sword embryo closer to perfection. In the end, it would become a sword, a sharp sword. Recalling the process of forging a sword in the past, a complete sword was formed under his hand. Chu Mu's eyes flickered with a bright light. In his mental world, a sword gradually took shape from the very beginning. A complete sword could be divided into 3 major parts: the hilt, the blade, and the scabbard. The hilt was the part that was held by the hand. It was divided into 3 parts. The first part was the sword head, also known as the sword head. It could be seen as a decoration, but its purpose was to balance the center of gravity of the whole sword, making it easier to feel. The second part was the hilt, which was where the hand held the sword. When the hand held the sword, the hand held the hilt. The third part was the sword guard, also known as the guard. It separated the hilt from the blade. It could prevent the sword from being cut by the opponent's sword when 2 swords collided. It could also prevent the opponent's hand from slipping when the sword stabbed the target. In short, the existence of the sword guard was to protect the hand holding the sword. The second major part was called the blade. The blade was the part of the sword that had a sharp edge. It could be divided into 5 parts, and there were also 4 parts. The first part was called the sword jaw. It was a piece of metal between the blade and the sword guard. Its purpose was to prevent the scabbard from falling off. It could also be used to block attacks. It could also be used as an aesthetic decoration. This part could be included or not. The second part was called the sword spine. It was the protruding part in the middle of the blade. It had the effect of strengthening the blade. It was like the spine of the human body. The 2 edges were symmetrical and maintained the balance of the blade. The third part was called the sword edge. It belonged to the 2 sides of the blade. It was very sharp and had a shocking lethality. The fourth part was called the sword edge. It was located at the end of the blade. It was in an arc shape. Compared to the blade of the blade, it was thinner and more resilient. Its sharpness was even more terrifying than the sword edge. The fifth part was also the last part of the blade. It was called the sword tip. It was located at the end of the blade. It was the point where the arc of the sword edge converged. Its sharpness was shocking and incomparably sharp. It could pierce through everything. The third major part was called the scabbard. There was no classification. The scabbard's function was to store the sword and protect the blade. Some excellent scabbards could also be used to maintain and even sharpen the blade. Some sword skills also required the cooperation of the scabbard. A complete sword was composed of 3 major parts. Sword skills were the application of the sword. They could be classified into various major parts and then into various minor parts. The memories and experience of a swordsman and the memories and experience of a swordsman were different. Although there were some differences in the way of cultivation and the division of realms, they were still sword skills. They were all sword cultivators. Different paths led to the same goal. Between the 2, they each had their own merit. They complemented each other and eventually perfected each other. All kinds of enlightenment in the past flashed like lightning. Sword forging, sword skills, sword forging was also a kind of cultivation. Sword skills and sword skills were also based on the sword. They were all sword skills. In fact, what was the difference? There were thousands of sword skills and thousands of sword skills. In the end, it was nothing more than to completely release the true meaning of the sword. It was to deduce and interpret to the extreme. The enlightenment became more and more obvious. The 2 sword souls and sword wills in the spiritual world vibrated. The 210 sword shadows flickered as they vibrated. They released a shocking wave of sword wills and resonated with each other. A sword has a sword head, a sword handle, a sword guard, a sword jaw, a sword spine, a sword edge, a sword tip, and a sword scabbard. Different parts have different application skills. The sword tip condenses a bit of sharpness, which is good at piercing and piercing through everything in the world. Everything is hard and even void. The sword edge is thin and flexible, which is good at cutting or cutting. It can easily and silently cut through all resistance. The sword edge is sharp and hard, which can cut, slash, and erase. In this way, sword skills can be classified into 4 major categories. The first category is the fencing sword skill. It uses the sword edge to attack, cutting, and hitting. The second category is the stabbing sword skill. It uses the sword edge to attack. It stabs from all angles and perfectly displays the sword edge's shocking sharpness. The third category is the fencing sword skill. It mainly uses the sword edge to interpret the hardness and sharpness of the sword edge. It can hack, slash, sweep, and intercept to attack or intercept the opponent. The fourth category is the washing sword skill. The washing sword skill doesn't mean to clean the sword. It refers to the application of the sword edge in a straight line or arc. It can be used to swing, sweep, whip, tease, and so on, point the sword. The sword tip pecks from top to bottom, penetrating the sword tip with force. Stabbing sword, flat stabbing sword, upward stabbing sword, downward stabbing sword, probing sword, wiping sword, crushing sword. Spiritual thoughts gushed out like a fountain. At some point, Chu Mu, who was sitting cross-legged, had already stood up. With the heaven-beheading sword in hand, he began to practice stabbing, wiping, crushing. He fully demonstrated the essence of the sword skill. After the last sword strike, he stood still. Countless insights surged, and the sword chi around him surged. It was not the fluctuation of sword origin, but the pure fluctuation of sword skill. After 30 breaths, his long hair fluttered, and the violent sword chi shot out. This shall be called the sword skill quintessence. It was as if he was swearing to the heavens, swearing to the forest of 10,000 sword steels. The moment Chu Mu's voice fell, the forest of 10,000 sword steels shook. The sword cry of 11,350 sword steels was melodious. Chapter 1403. The myriad sword steel trembled and hummed. The lines on the sword steels shone brightly and shot out, causing the steel forest to shake. Chu Mu was surprised. He stood up and looked around. At this moment, beside the last of the 30 top-grade sword steels, a sword steel broke out of the ground with a rumbling sound. It continued to rise until it finally stopped at a height of 9 meters. On the black sword steel, lines began to appear. Chu Mu stared at the new sword steel, staring at the lines that formed on the sword steel. There seemed to be only one line, but there also seemed to be many lines. A line of words appeared at the bottom left corner of the sword steel. True God Sword Sect's 38th Generation Sect Master, Chu Mu Sword Technique True Enlightenment. Staring at the sword steel and looking at the lines on it, Chu Mu immediately understood the names of the lines on the sword steel, just like how he would know the names of the sword techniques recorded on the other sword steels. Sword Technique True Enlightenment. This was the record of what a sword was and what a sword technique was that Chu Mu finally comprehended after comprehending the 11,350 sword steels and using his own ability to fuse and comprehend. He looked back on his own sword forging process and finally comprehended the records of what a sword was and what a sword technique was. This was not a sword technique, but a pure comprehension. It was a relatively complete comprehension. It was a comprehension that Chu Mu had walked on the path of the sword until now. In the future, if there were sword cultivators who had the chance to enter here and see Chu Mu's sword steel, they would be able to comprehend the sword technique True Enlightenment on it. And comprehending the sword technique True Enlightenment would allow one's understanding of the sword and sword techniques to continue to deepen, reaching a profound realm. I didn't expect it to be a top-grade sword steel. Chu Mu was secretly pleasantly surprised. He was confident that if he obtained the recognition of the myriad sword steel, it would definitely not be a low-grade sword steel. It might not even stop at the level of a middle-grade sword steel. However, he had never expected it to be a top-grade sword steel. But thinking back, with the 11,350 sword steels as the foundation, combined with the sword of heaven and earth's sword momentum, sword forging technique, sword techniques, and so on, it was not strange that a top-grade sword steel was erected in the myriad sword steel. After carefully looking at the top-grade sword steel and the sword technique true enlightenment on it, Chu Mu had a new understanding of the sword technique true enlightenment. Not bad, a top-grade sword steel. Bai Ling's voice sounded in his ears. You have obtained the recognition of the myriad sword steel. Let's go and receive the final inheritance. As Bai Ling's voice fell, Chu Mu only felt his vision blur. Light and shadow flashed past, as if they were passing through layers of time and space. When they stopped, the dense sword steels in front of him had disappeared. In the spacious area, the light was very dim. Looking at the weak light source, Chu Mu was stunned. Following the stairs up, at the end, there was a seat. The seat was high up, isolated from the rest of the world, as if it was located in the deep void. This is the center of the True God Sword Sect's forbidden area. That seat is called the Sword God Seat. Bai Ling appeared beside Chu Mu and said softly. Looking at the seat, there was a complicated expression. The previous sect masters of the True God Sword Sect had to obtain the recognition of the myriad sword steel to enter here, cross the 99 stairs, sit on the Sword God Seat, and receive the final inheritance. Go up and sit on the Sword God Seat, and you will be able to receive the final inheritance of the True God Sword Sect. Bai Ling said and did not speak any more. Sword God Seat. Chu Mu's emotions surged as he looked at the seat on the 99 stairs with a blazing gaze. Taking a deep breath, Chu Mu took a big step forward and walked towards the stairs. These stairs were the stairs in the void. There was a total of 99 stairs, and he did not know what mysteries they contained. Chu Mu walked to the front of the stairs and looked down. It was pitch black like an abyss, and it made his heart palpitate. Retracting his gaze, he calmed his mind and lifted his foot, taking a step forward. His surging emotions also calmed down. His right foot landed on the first flight of stairs. Instantly, a strange feeling came from the bottom of his foot and spread throughout his body. It was indescribable. His left foot followed closely and landed on the first flight of stairs. When both of his feet landed on the stairs, the strange feeling became even more obvious. It was as if he had entered a new world in an instant, and the path ahead became incomparably distant. There were 99 flights of stairs in the void. Each flight of stairs was only 1 meter wide, and each flight of stairs contained a kind of mystery. The mystery that could not be described clearly seemed to be helping Chu Mu to comprehend something. It made him feel like he was immersed in it and carefully savoring it. The stairs in the void should be able to pass. Bai Ling looked at Chu Mu's figure and said quietly. Time passed slowly. Chu Mu was still on the first flight of stairs. The various mysteries caused him to stop in his tracks, and he stood there motionlessly to comprehend. Suddenly, Chu Mu woke up. The mysteries of the stairs were said to be helping him comprehend something, but he did not comprehend anything. It was only exhausting his mind and delaying his steps. Luckily, he woke up in time. Otherwise, the longer he stayed, the more exhausted his mind would be, and the more disadvantageous it would be. Understanding this point, the mysterious feeling instantly disappeared. He continued to step forward, and immediately left the first flight of stairs and stepped onto the second flight of stairs. When both of his feet landed on the second flight of stairs, a bone-chilling feeling caused Chu Mu's expression to change. His hair stood on end. An incomparably sharp sword light came straight at him, filled with killing intent. His instincts were faster than his thoughts. He immediately dodged, pulled out his sword, and slashed out. The incomparably sharp sword light suddenly disappeared without a trace. Chu Mu's slash contained an unfathomable mystery. He himself did not feel it, but Bai Ling's eyes lit up. He has already touched the surface of the true meaning of the sword. The bone-chilling sense of danger still surrounded him, causing Chu Mu to not dare to relax in the slightest. The sword light that had disappeared suddenly reappeared from a strange angle and attacked. His reaction was quick, and he did not need to think. He immediately dodged and counterattacked. After repeating this a few times, Chu Mu felt as if his sword had stabbed something. The sword light disappeared again, and he naturally crossed the second flight of stairs and stepped onto the third flight of stairs. The 99 flight of stairs in the air, each flight of stairs contained a kind of mystery. Some of these mysteries were used to delay Chu Mu's progress, some were used to attack and try to kill the person who entered, and some were actually useful to the person who entered. For example, now that Chu Mu had stepped onto the 10th flight of stairs, he had a mysterious comprehension on the 10th flight of stairs. Although he did not know what use it had, he felt that his understanding of the sword had deepened a little. He stepped onto the 11th flight of stairs, the 12th flight of stairs, the 13th flight of stairs. Very quickly, Chu Mu stepped onto the 18th flight of stairs and entered the 19th flight of stairs. He discovered that this flight of stairs actually helped him in his comprehension, as if it was a summary of his experience on the previous flight of stairs. Could it be that there are 99 flights of stairs, and every flight of stairs is a summary of the next flight of stairs? Chu Mu secretly guessed. The truth was not far from what he had guessed. Throughout the history of the True God Sword sect, there were outstanding sword cultivators who had obtained the recognition of the Forest of Thousand Swords, and were able to step onto the 99 flight of stairs in the air. However, there were less than 100 people who were able to pass the flight of stairs and sit on the Sword God's seat. And there were less than 10 people who were able to obtain the final inheritance of the Sword God's seat. Bai Ling looked at Chu Mu's figure with a deep and distant gaze, as if she had traveled through endless time and space, and saw the figures of the outstanding sword cultivators of the True God Sword sect advancing on the flight of stairs in the air. I wonder if you can pass through the 99 flight of stairs, and if you can obtain the inheritance of the Sword God's seat. Chu Mu did not know about the glory of the flight of stairs and the Sword God's seat. Right now, he was wholeheartedly moving forward, intending to pass the 99 flight of stairs and sit on the Sword God's seat. As for how difficult it would be, he did not know because Bai Ling did not tell him. And the reason why Bai Ling did not tell him was because she did not want to pressure Chu Mu. The 49th flight of stairs, the 50th flight of stairs, the 51st flight of stairs. Unknowingly, Chu Mu had already surpassed many sword cultivators who had been able to step onto the flight of stairs in the past. After all, being recognized by the Forest of 10,000 Sword Steels did not mean that one could pass the 99 flight of stairs. That was a completely different test. Most sword cultivators could only stop at the first 33 steps. There were not many who could reach the middle 33 steps, and even fewer who could reach the latter 33 steps. And just as Bai Ling said, there were less than 100 sword cultivators who could sit on the Sword God's seat. Before Chu Mu, the Forest of 10,000 Sword Steels had a total of 11,350 sword steels. In other words, there had been 11,350 sword cultivators who had been recognized by the Forest of 10,000 Sword Steels and stepped onto the flight of stairs. Less than 100 of them had stepped onto the flight of stairs and sat on the Sword God's seat. This ratio was 1 in 100. Such a 1 in 100 ratio was not simple, because each and every one of those people would be shocking peerless geniuses in the outside world. Each and every one of them would be able to make a name for themselves and become famous. Such peerless geniuses were even 1 in 100 among the monstrous geniuses. Their value was frighteningly high. One flight of stairs after another, Chu Mu continued to advance. Even if he was obstructed, he would still continue to advance, like a hot knife through butter. The 90th step, There are still 9 more steps. Bai Ling could not help but become nervous. 99 steps, there were only 9 left. Would Chu Mu stop at the front, or would he cross all the steps and ascend to the sword god seat? As for whether he would be able to obtain the final inheritance after ascending to the sword god's seat, that was a matter for the future. It was not something that needed to be considered now. Bai Ling knew that Chu Mu's talent was outstanding, but in the history of the True God Sword sect, there were many sword cultivators who were shockingly talented. There were even some who were not inferior to Chu Mu. The 91st step, the 92nd step, the 93rd step, finally, Chu Mu arrived at the 98th step. Finally, it was the 99th step. When Chu Mu stepped onto the 99th step, Bai Ling's emotions fluctuated greatly. The final moment had arrived, but Chu Mu was in a predicament. Chapter 1404. The 99th step of the Void Staircase. Chu Mu stood on it. The space in front of him stretched endlessly. No matter where he went, he could not see the end. Xiao Chen stopped and closed his eyes, eliminating all distracting thoughts. He calmed his heart and focused. The entire space fell silent. When he closed his eyes, he could not see. However, he could feel everything around him. Chu Mu could clearly sense everything around him. Xiao Chen's thoughts continuously spread out. This staircase had a strange mystery. From the outside, it was clearly only 1 meter wide. However, when he was inside, it was like a boundless world. Perceiving, comprehending, and repeating, suddenly, Xiao Chen opened his tightly shut eyes. A bright light shot out as he locked onto a point in front of him and thrust his sword forward. The sword could not be seen, only a strand of light that looked like a strand of hair. It was like a bubble had been pierced. The boundless space dissipated, and the sword divine supreme throne appeared before Chu Mu, within reach. Chu Mu took a deep breath and withdrew the smile on his face. Then, he took large strides and walked out of the 99th step of the Void Staircase. Bai Ling also heaved a sigh of relief. Then, she was lifted up again. This was because the next step was the most important one. Chu Mu walked to the Sword Divine Supreme throne and stood before it. However, he did not sit down immediately. Instead, he carefully sized up the Sword Divine Supreme throne. The entire throne was dark gold in color. It was a dark gold color that came from the inside out. It was ancient and profound, as if it had been there for a long time. Countless lines covered it, and in the center of those lines were traces of silver. The silver was very pure and sharp, like sharp swords. The dark gold and silver contained boundless mysteries related to the mysteries of the sword. Xiao Chen slowly turned around and sat down. When Chu Mu sat on the Sword Divine Supreme throne, his entire body trembled involuntarily. An indescribable feeling spread throughout his body. There seemed to be a sacred chant in Xiao Chen's ears. Countless sword images seemed to appear before him. Each sword image represented a peerless divine sword. Every peerless divine sword was trembling, letting out a clear sword hum. The waves were like a tide gathering together like a sacred chant. Divine song of sword Tao. Countless sword chimes converged to form a divine song of the sword. It continuously entered Chu Mu's ears, his spiritual world, and his soul, making him feel very comfortable. The heart of the sword in his heart also resonated and trembled gently. This was the clear hum of the sword, the song of the sword, the music that belonged to the way of the sword. To sword cultivators, such a divine song of the way of the sword could cleanse the soul and purify the heart of the sword, but to non-sword cultivators, it was like poison. Chu Mu was a sword cultivator, a true sword cultivator. As such, the divine song of the sword did not harm him at all. Instead, it brought him endless benefits. I wonder if you'll be able to endure the baptism of the divine song of swordsmanship until the end? Bai Ling wondered. The divine song of swordsmanship had great benefits for sword cultivators, but at the same time, it was also a test in disguise. It was a test that belonged to the sword god's supreme seat. It was not so easy to obtain the final inheritance. The divine song of swordsmanship continued, faintly discernible. Chu-mu entered a wonderful state. In this state, the two sword souls in his spiritual world and the sword essence on them trembled gently with the divine song of swordsmanship. They let out a soft sword hum, gradually matching the frequency of the divine song of swordsmanship. The fluctuations were the same, and they were being tempered in this resonance. Sword cultivators cultivated by developing sword essence, condensing sword essence, and gathering sword soul. When a sword cultivator broke through to the eternal realm, the sword soul would transform into a sword soul. Before that, the sword soul could be tempered again and again. However, there were too few ways to temper the sword soul. Countless sword cultivators could only temper their sword souls passively, or they could only temper their sword souls when they encountered some opportunities. Even a genius like Chu-mu was the same. The divine song of swordsmanship was a kind of opportunity, a great opportunity to temper the sword soul. After the sword soul was refined, it would become even purer, which would then affect the sword intent within the sword soul, causing the sword intent to become even purer. The purer the sword intent was, the easier it would be to control it, and the power it could unleash would also be greater. Chu-mu's sword intent was at the top of the divine grade. It could be said that it was at the peak of the current known sword intent. However, he had not been able to fully display the power of this peak divine grade sword intent. This was not to say that the peak divine grade sword intent was not strong enough, but that Chu-mu could only display a portion of its power, 50 to 60%. It was similar to a human's body containing a terrifying amount of power, but without enough training, without a high level of skill, it was impossible to display that terrifying power. The principle was the same. Peak divine grade sword intent was the pinnacle of sword intent. It was incomparably profound and powerful, but it also meant that it was harder to display its full power. As the sword soul was tempered, as the sword intent was tempered, the sword intent became purer and easier to control. However, there was a limit to any kind of tempering. It was impossible to achieve it overnight. As time passed, the divine song of swordsmanship was still as beautiful as ever, but gradually, Chu-mu began to feel the burden. The burden on the sword intent, the burden on his soul, a heavy pressure that felt like an invisible mountain was pressing down on him. The divine song of swordsmanship was used for cleansing, but if it was overdone, it would have the opposite effect. When Chu-mu began to feel the burden, it meant that the divine song of swordsmanship's positive effects were coming to an end. Following that, it would gradually turn negative. Chu-mu only had two choices. The first was to stop. If he stood up from the sword divine throne, the divine song of swordsmanship would disappear, and the tempering would also stop. However, the consequence would be that he would not be able to obtain the final inheritance, because each person only had one chance. The second choice was to persevere until the divine song of swordsmanship stopped on its own. There were only two choices. One was to give up and the other was to persevere. If he chose the second choice, but he could not persevere until the end, his soul and sword intent would be damaged, and it would be difficult to recover. It could be said that his future path would be cut off, and he would have no hope of reaching the peak or reaching the other shore. What should he choose? In the past, those who could sit on the sword divine throne would most likely not be able to persevere and choose to give up. Although they could not obtain the final inheritance, they still benefited a lot from the divine song of swordsmanship. Chu-mu did not hesitate at all. He did not even consider the first choice. Persevere. He had to persevere and do his best to persevere until the end. The path of swordsmanship required an indomitable determination to cut through all difficulties and obstacles. Either he would die a horrible death, or he would be successful and famous. Chu-mu did not know if he would perish or succeed if he persevered. He only had one choice, and that was to persevere. Because if he did not persevere, he would be giving up on his swordsmanship. He focused all his mind to resist the tempering of the divine song of swordsmanship. The burden became more and more obvious. Chu Mu closed his eyes tightly, and his expression was cold and solemn. Gradually, he became solemn, and his eyebrows frowned unconsciously. Bai Ling's heart was in his mouth, and his breathing seemed to have stopped, even though he did not need to breathe in his current state. The final moment had arrived. Would Chu Mu be able to obtain the final inheritance of the Sword Divine Throne? From Bai Ling's point of view, he naturally hoped that Chu Mu would be able to obtain the final inheritance of the Sword Divine Throne, but he also did not wish for Chu Mu's soul and sword intent to be damaged. The final inheritance of the Sword Divine Throne was a secret technique, a very powerful secret technique, a secret technique that even great emperors could use. If Chu Mu were to obtain the secret technique and successfully cultivate it, his strength would increase a lot, and he would become even more powerful. If he could not obtain the secret technique, it would not affect Chu Mu's climb to the peak of swordsmanship. However, it would be better if he could obtain it. Persevere. There was only one thought in his mind, and that was to persevere and persevere. The burden became greater and greater, and his consciousness gradually became blurry, like a candle in the wind that could be extinguished at any time. Suddenly, the divine light will in his spiritual world trembled, and released a magnificent light. It was so grand that it made Chu Mu's consciousness feel warm, like a person walking in the snow, entering a warm house with a bonfire, and drinking a mouthful of hot soup. His consciousness gradually became clear, and he continued to resist and persevere. The burden became greater and greater, and it made Chu Mu feel more and more uncomfortable. However, the divine light will illuminated Chu Mu's consciousness, so that he would not fall into a coma. This feeling was like living and dying at the same time, and it was a huge torture that was enough to drive people crazy. He did not know how much time had passed. Perhaps it was just a short quarter of an hour, or perhaps it was 1,000 years, or even 10,000 years. The continuous divine song of swordsmanship stopped. When the divine song of swordsmanship stopped, the burden that was about to make him collapse also quickly disappeared. At this time, Chu Mu had really reached a critical point. The divine light will was also affected, suppressed, and dimmed. The help it provided to his consciousness was also greatly weakened. Fortunately, the divine song of swordsmanship stopped. Otherwise, Chu Mu would not be able to persevere for a few more breaths. When the divine song of swordsmanship stopped, the burden disappeared, and his consciousness became stronger. He felt very relaxed, as if the sky was high and the earth was far away. A buzzing sound rang out, like the clear cry of 10,000 swords, full of joy. When it fell into his ears, it made Chu Mu feel very comfortable. Immediately, the divine sword thrown under him trembled, and a dark golden light lit up. The fine silver light seemed to come alive, like threads of sword radiance swimming around. The entire divine sword throne looked like it was intertwined with dark golden and silver light, and it was a magnificent scene. As the silver sword radiance swam around, they all used Chu Mu's body as their destination, surging into Chu Mu's body. After rapidly swimming through his limbs and bones, they all rushed to his head, into his spiritual world, into his mind, and into his soul. Each silver sword radiance was thinner than a strand of hair. Each silver sword radiance was a rune, an ancient sword Dao rune that Chu Mu had never seen before. It was a sword Dao rune that only existed in the age of the gods. Every rune contained incomparably profound mysteries. There were tens of thousands of silver sword radiance, which meant that there were also tens of thousands of sword Dao runes, and they contained an enormous amount of information. For a moment, Chu Mu only felt that his head was stuffed to the point of bursting. Chapter 1405. His eyes widened, filled with shock, and his expression became sluggish. Looks like he's already survived the tempering of the divine song of the sword and is about to receive the final legacy. When Bai Ling saw the expression on Chu Mu's face, she felt relieved and relaxed. After relaxing, Bai Ling released the power of her soul. The entire forbidden area was under her control. Looks like I'll give this kid a gift after he receives the legacy. Bai Ling smiled. The silver sword light constantly entered Chu Mu's mind, entering the depths of his soul like a brand. Any silver sword ray that entered Chu Mu's soul would definitely condense into an ancient sword Dao rune. Each sword Dao rune would emit an ancient aura and an incomparably sharp silver edge. Every sword rune was branded into Chu Mu's soul and could not be removed. Chu Mu's thoughts froze, unable to operate. The power contained within the sword runes was just too shocking. He could only accept it passively and continuously. Every time a sword rune appeared in his soul, Chu Mu's soul would become a little more burdened. It was like an ordinary person with a few kilograms of weight on him. He was constantly approaching his limit and about to surpass it. His thoughts froze, unable to operate. He felt like he had lost consciousness and was in a vegetative state. Chu Mu was unable to sense anything in the outside world. He was unable to sense the passage of time. He was unable to sense anything. As a result, he had no idea how much time had passed. It was as if he had been frozen for thousands of years. His sluggish and shocked eyes trembled slightly. His thoughts began to operate again, like an ancient rusty machine being restarted. It was extremely slow at first, but it gradually sped up. Only when his thoughts could operate normally did Chu Mu awaken. He suddenly felt as if thousands of years had passed. There was an indescribable sense of vicissitude. His head was still swollen. It felt like many things had been forcefully stuffed into his head, causing him to constantly feel uncomfortable and unable to concentrate. This state was extremely disadvantageous. He had to get used to it. He focused all of his mind and consciousness and entered his soul to examine the sword runes. The sword runes were embedded in his soul like an innate brand. They flickered with a silver luster, like cold stars in the depths of the void. When Chu Mu stared at one of the sword runes, he immediately felt a sharpness and unparalleled profoundness surge towards him. This was the first time he had come into contact with a sword rune. He could not understand it at all. However, the moment his consciousness came into contact with the sword rune, a message was transmitted to his consciousness, allowing him to understand the content within. The contents of a single sword rune was relatively simple, so he could not see anything. Only when the contents of multiple sword runes were combined could he see the profoundness. Chu Mu came into contact with one sword rune after another. He discovered that the sword runes were divided into two types. One was sword rune and the other was Dao rune. In other words, a portion of the sword runes looked like the ancient word sword, while the other type of sword rune looked like the ancient word Dao. However, every sword rune had a slight difference. Every Dao rune also had a slight difference. Chu Mu also noticed this, but he did not understand the profoundness of this difference. This was because he did not understand sword runes. If someone who was proficient in sword runes saw this, they would naturally understand the profoundness within. Not understanding sword runes did not prevent Chu Mu from understanding their contents. He spent time coming into contact with one sword rune after another. He read and understood them one by one and connected them together. In the process of reading, he was constantly familiarizing himself with the pressure brought by the sword runes. The swelling feeling in his head was also somewhat alleviated, making him feel more relaxed. It turns out that part of the content of these sword runes is the content of Sword Universe. Chu Mu thought to himself. The content of this sword universe is the same as the one that Senior Bai Ling imparted to me. However, there are still some differences. Although the content of Senior Bai Ling's sword universe is ancient, it is still within the scope of words. However, the sword universe that the Sword Divine Throne imparted is sword rune. The sword universe of the sword rune should be the most primitive version. The sword universe that Senior Bai Ling imparted to me was imparted to me after he obtained the inheritance. It is different. I guess the original sword universe can only be directly imparted by the sword divine throne. Chu Mu's guess was actually correct. The content of the sword universe of the sword rune was the same as what Bai Ling imparted. However, because it was the most primitive version of the sword rune, it had a power that Bai Ling did not have. It was a kind of mystery. This profundity would allow Chu Mu to comprehend sword heaven-earth even more directly. Chu Mu was very happy. The first half of the sword universe is the same as what Senior Bai Ling imparted. The second half is the secret method that Senior Bai Ling mentioned. As he muttered to himself, Chu Mu's eyes shot out an astonishingly sharp glint. His face was full of excitement and joy because of that secret technique. He had lived for hundreds of years and had experienced a lot. He had seen many secret techniques and heard of many more. However, none of them could be compared with the secret technique that he had inherited now. Not to mention being compared with it, it was impossible to even have a trace of it. The difference was too big. Such a secret method was unheard of. In the beginning, the secret method that Chu Mu had come into contact with was the burning blood change. Deshang's burning blood change could increase his strength by 2 times. That kind of secret method was at the top of the origin realm. Even among the secret methods of the divine condensation realm, it was at the top level. The secret methods of the nirvana realm could increase one's strength by 5 times. They were at the top level, and only Deshang could possess them. Only the secret methods of the eternal realm, which was the saint level, could exceed the limit of 5 times. The top saint-level secret methods, after Deshang had reached the complete realm, could increase one's strength by 10 times. In other words, if a nirvana realm cultivator cultivated a top-notch saint-grade secret technique and cultivated it to the mastery stage, then their strength would directly increase by 10 times once they executed it. It was equivalent to directly surpassing the cultivation of a heavenly layer, causing those who were already strong to become even stronger. However, since a saint-grade secret technique was a saint-grade secret technique, it wasn't that easy to cultivate. At the nirvana realm, it would take an unknown amount of time to cultivate a saint-grade secret technique to the mastery realm. Some secret techniques even required harsh conditions to be cultivated successfully. Now, the second half of Sword World that Chu Mu had inherited was a secret technique, but he didn't know how to define it. This was because the first level of this secret technique, once mastered, could increase one's strength by 10 times. It was only the first level, but it already had the power of a top-notch saint-level secret technique. And this secret technique had a total of 3 levels. The first level increased one's strength by 10 times. The second level increased one's strength by 100 times. The third level increased one's strength by 10,000 times. In the Nirvana realm, the difference in strength between each celestial layer was 10 times. In the Eternal realm, the difference in strength between each celestial layer was, on average, about 100 times. In other words, cultivating the second layer of the secret technique would allow one to directly jump one celestial layer. The difference between the Eternal realm and the Eternal realm was too great. A difference of 100 times between each heavens was too shocking. In the Nirvana realm and below, it was not difficult to challenge people of a higher level. True geniuses could often do it. However, in the Eternal realm, it was difficult to challenge people of a higher level. Only peerless geniuses could do it. If one cultivated the second level of this secret technique, their strength would increase by 100-fold. Disregarding other aspects, just in terms of cultivation, they would be able to directly cross the gap of one heavenly layer. If they cultivated the third level of the secret technique, they would be able to directly cross the gap of 2 heavenly layers when they used it. Such a secret method, coupled with other abilities, could easily cross the gap of 1 heavens, 2 heavens, and even 3 heavens to kill powerful enemies. Chu Mu was 100% sure that if such a secret method was leaked, it would definitely cause chaos in the Deep Blue World. Could even lead to the destruction of the Deep Blue World. It was a terrifying secret technique that could even be used by great emperors. Chu Mu's breathing was rapid, his chest heaving up and down. He was extremely shocked by this secret method. After a long time, he gradually calmed down. He exhaled a long breath, his heart still filled with excitement. If the current him could cultivate the third level of this secret method, he could completely kill an ordinary 2-star sword saint. Facing an ordinary 3-star sword saint, he would not be killed. He could even put up a fight. The current him possessed the strength to fight against an ordinary 1-star martial saint expert. However, he would not be able to seriously injure them, let alone kill them. It's a pity. Although this secret method is terrifying, it's extremely difficult to cultivate. Just the first level alone requires various treasures. There are a few treasures that are extremely precious. I only have one of them. Chu Mu sighed inwardly. This feeling was really complicated. It was like a poor man who saw a mountain of gold in front of him. While he was wild with joy, he realized that there was a torrent of magma between him and the mountain of gold. He had to think of every method and go through untold hardships to cross the torrent of magma and truly reach the mountain of gold. There's no other way. I already have most of the treasures here. I'm only missing 4, and they are the most precious 4. I can only slowly search for them. Chu Mu was speechless. This time, he had another goal for his trip to the deep blue world. It was a goal that he had to complete. Otherwise, no matter how good this secret method was, it would be wasted. At this moment, Chu Mu also saw that beside Senior Bai Ling, a few more figures had appeared at some point. Chapter 1406. Around Broken Cloud Mountain, water vapor was dense, surging like a tide. Tens of thousands of Shark Clan soldiers were densely packed, encircling the entire Broken Cloud Mountain, not allowing even a drop of water to pass through. The army pressuring the border brought a terrifying pressure to everyone. In the distance, the saint-level experts of Heavenly Saint Cult and other forces on Lianyun Island were watching. They didn't dare to fight against the Shark Clan army, but they didn't want to give up either. Therefore, everyone and every force was waiting for the people who entered the forbidden grounds of True God Sword Sect to come out. As long as someone came out alive, it meant that that person had most likely obtained the inheritance of True God Sword Sect. As a powerful sword sect that had flourished for many years, and could even be said to be the #1 sword sect in Deep Blue World, True God Sword Sect's foundation was unimaginable. There was no comparison between the flourishing Heavenly Saint Cult and True God Sword Sect. It was like comparing a firefly to the bright moon. The reason why Heavenly Saint Cult was said to be a strong enemy of True God Sword Sect was because True God Sword Sect had already declined back then, and was no longer as glorious as before. In fact, no matter how powerful True God Sword Sect was in the past, the current Supreme Elder of True God Sword Sect couldn't explain it. It had been nearly half a year since the huge commotion on Broken Cloud Mountain. Heavenly Saint Cult and other forces had already asked for reinforcements from their respective sections. Therefore, the number of saint-level experts in Heavenly Saint Cult had increased from the original dozens to more than 100, and there was even a tyrannical 9-star saint holding the fort. It was the same for other forces. The number of saint-level experts had increased, and there were very few below saint level. After all, once a conflict broke out, it would be a conflict between saint-level experts, and Nirvana realm cultivators were like ants. The army of the Shark Clan was different. Apart from the saint-level warriors, the rest of their warriors were all high-level Shark Clan warriors, which was the Nirvana realm. When they joined forces to form a grand formation, they could easily contend against and even slaughter a saint-level expert. Other than the Shark Clan army and saint-level experts of various sects and forces on Lianyun Island, there were also some experts from other islands who heard the news, and a small number of solo experts. At this moment, a sword light flew over from afar and stopped at the northeast corner. It was a man with long black hair casually tied behind his head with a strand of grass. He wore a plain long robe and held a sword in his arms. His eyes were flickering with a sharp light, and the corner of his mouth had a faintly discernible smile. This person, its sword maniac Ling Fengxiao, sword maniac Ling Fengxiao is here as well. This is going to be even more lively. Listening to the discussions of the crowd, the young man who had just arrived was clearly very famous. He was respectfully known as the Sword Maniac and was one of the more famous lone travelers on the Blue Sea. Sword Maniac Ling Fengxiao's cultivation base was only at the third heavenly layer of Aeon, a 3-star sword saint. However, his battle record was impressive. He had killed more than 4-star saints. There were even rumors that he had escaped unscathed from a 5-star saint. That was why he was so famous. As for Ling Fengxiao, he was loyal to the Sword Maniac. Wherever a powerful sword cultivator appeared, he would go and challenge them. Hence, he was called the Sword Maniac. This was the place where the True God Sword sect used to be located. Ling Fengxiao had come here more than once to temper his sword intent. This time, he had also rushed over after hearing the news. Other than Sword Maniac Ling Fengxiao, there were other famous lone wolves who had arrived as well. For example, Wind King, Ice Demon, and other saint-level experts. However, lone wolves were ultimately lone wolves. They wouldn't think of joining forces. For them, it was better to go alone than to join forces. This was an opportunity. Even though the Shark Clan army had surrounded the Cloud Top Mountain, no one gave up. Even though they wouldn't take the initiative to provoke the Shark Clan army, sometimes it was necessary to take advantage of the chaos to make a move when there were enough benefits. As time passed, more and more people arrived. The Shark Clan saint-level experts also felt that something was wrong. This was because the total number of human saint-level experts who had arrived had already reached several thousand. If a battle really broke out, the Shark Clan army would most likely have to face several thousand human saint-level experts at the same time. Even if the several thousand human saint-level experts didn't join forces, they still had a terrifying strength. The Shark Clan army couldn't contend against them at all. Understanding this, the Shark Clan army also requested for reinforcement. Not long after, a group of Shark Clan saint-level experts arrived. There were nearly 100 of them. Adding the original dozens of Shark Clan saint-level experts, there were more than 100 of them. The strongest among them was a 9-star saint. His aura surged like a vast ocean, bringing with it an incomparably fierce aura. Greetings to Lord Sword Sharkly. All of the Shark Clan clansmen bowed to this 9-star saint. Their movements were orderly and their aura was astonishing. Sword Sharkly, so it's him. The eyes of the 9-star saint from Heavenly Saint cult flickered. His expression was grave, and there was a hint of fear in his eyes. Sword Shark Clan's 9-star saint, Sword Sharkly, had an illustrious reputation. He was hated by many humans. His strength was powerful, and his methods were cruel. No one knew how many humans had died in his hand. Sword Sharkly looked around. His incomparably terrifying and fiendish gaze made many saint-level experts shudder. They didn't dare to look him in the eye. Sword Sharkly snorted coldly and let out a disdainful smile. It was like a heavy slap to the faces of the human saint-level experts. They were furious, but they didn't dare to say anything. The difference in strength was too great. In addition to the presence of the Shark Clan army, if they attacked in anger, there would only be one outcome: death. They would be killed by Sword Sharkly as a deterrent to the other humans. Not long after, another incomparably tyrannical and vast aura surged over like a huge wave. Amidst the shockingly dense water vapor, the expressions of the human saint-level experts changed drastically. They're here again. It's the Tiger Shark Clan army. The Shark Clan army from before was the Sword Shark Clan. Now it was the Tiger Shark Clan. Both belonged to the Shark Clan. They were two branches of the Shark Clan. They were very powerful, second only to the Shark Clan's royal clan, the Emperor Shark Clan. There were tens of thousands of Sword Shark Clan army and tens of thousands of Tiger Shark Clan army. In total, there were close to 100,000 of them. Among them, there were more than 300 Saint-level experts. The rest were high-level Shark Clan, Nirvana Realm experts. Sword Sharkly, you're quite early. A loud and domineering voice sounded, surging over like a tide. Tiger Shark Jean, you're not late either. Sword Sharkly said. Tiger Shark Jean. The expressions of the human Saint-level experts changed drastically once again. Sword Sharkly was a super expert of the Sword Shark Clan, and Tiger Shark Jean was a super expert of the Tiger Shark Clan. They were both from the Shark Clan. They were very united against outsiders, but because they belonged to different branches, there was competition between them. Sword Sharkly had a thin appearance and a cold aura. Tiger Shark Jean had a tall and mighty appearance and a powerful aura. The two of them faced each other. When their eyes met, cold light collided, and there seemed to be thunder rumbling in the void. Human Saint-level experts, a bunch of trash. Suddenly, Tiger Shark Jean waved his hand, and the aura confrontation between him and Sword Sharkly disappeared. He glanced at the human Saint-level experts and laughed disdainfully, full of contempt. Indeed, although many of the islands in the Blue Sea were occupied by the human race, and there were many human Saint-level experts, there was still a big difference compared to the Sea Tribe. The Blue Sea was the territory of the Sea Tribe. As the saying went, I call the shots in my territory. In this place, the human race could not compete with the Sea Tribe. Compared to the human race, the Sea Tribe pursued the principle of survival of the fittest. However, they were unusually united against outsiders. This was something that the human race could not compare with. After years of weakness, the Sea Tribe experts naturally looked down on them. Close to 100,000 Shark Clan army surrounded Broken Cloud Mountain tightly. A terrifying pressure spread out, forcing the human Saint-level experts to retreat further away. Damn the Sea Tribe! Many people cursed secretly. Got it? Bai Ling asked. Got it. Chu Mu replied and glanced at the four people beside him. Good, good, good. Bai Ling laughed. Chu Mu was stunned. This was the first time he saw Bai Ling lose her composure since he knew her. The four people beside her seemed to have been forgotten by Bai Ling and Chu Mu. The True God Sword sect finally has a successor. After laughing, Bai Ling looked solemnly at Chu Mu. I hope that when you have enough ability, you can restore the glory of the True God Sword sect. This was also the first time Bai Ling had spoken so solemnly. It was a kind of trust, and Chu Mu immediately felt heavy. I will. Chu Mu took a deep breath and answered seriously. His voice was as sonorous as a sword. Bai Ling's eyes turned from sharp to gentle. These people followed you into the forbidden area. You decide how to deal with them, Bai Ling said. Chu Mu looked at the four people. He had seen 3 of them before. They were the Sword Saints who had tempered their sword will with him. One of them even threatened to take him as his last disciple. Underworld God Clan. Chu Mu's gaze fell on the black-robed man. He felt the cold aura of the other party. It was very familiar. His pupils shrank. He had been in the deep blue world for quite some time. During this time, he had only encountered 2 humans. It was the first time he had seen the Underworld God Clan. His thoughts changed. Senior Bai Ling, I want to enslave these 4. Chu Mu said bluntly. Okay. Bai Ling did not say anything. He waved his hand, and the 4 people did not have any power to resist. Bai Ling directly broke open their minds. Chu Mu planted a spiritual seed in them and controlled their life and death. Of the 3 Sword Saints, one was a 5-star Sword Saint, and the other 2 were 3-star Sword Saints. Their strength was not bad. Chu Mu planned to bring them back to the True Sword sect to serve as elders of the True Sword sect and strengthen the strength of the True Sword sect. As for the Underworld God Clan, he was only a 1-star saint. Chu Mu originally planned to kill him, but then he changed his mind. Why kill him? He might as well enslave him and send him into the underworld god clan. He would lure the other underworld god clan members out of the deep blue world, and finally kill them all in one fell swoop. It should be known that the underworld god clan members who had entered here and survived were all true geniuses. If they were all killed, it would definitely be a big blow to the underworld god clan. Chapter 1407. Close to 100,000 Shark Tribe soldiers surrounded Cloud Top Mountain. Each Shark Tribe warrior exuded an astonishing aura, which converged into a boundless ocean. Close to half a year's time was just a seclusion for a Nirvana realm cultivator. To a saint, it was nothing. It was like a quarter of an ordinary person's time. At this moment, there was a fluctuation at the top of Cloud Top Mountain. As soon as this fluctuation appeared, it immediately alarmed everyone. Thousands of human saint contenders were attracted, and looked over. Some even wanted to move closer. Humans, scram. Otherwise we'll kill without mercy. Tiger Shark Jean said angrily. A monstrous, ferocious and brutal aura surged like a raging sea. Kill! Tens of thousands of tiger shark warriors roared in unison. Their might Jin Tian seemed to shatter heaven and earth, causing ghosts and gods to tremble and all living things to submit. The thousands of human saint contenders, even the 9-star saints, could not help but turn pale. A vortex appeared where the fluctuation was. Everyone's gaze was focused on the vortex. They were on guard, not allowing anyone to leave. Under the gaze of nearly 100,000 people, a figure seemed to step out from the whirling vortex from a distant time and space. As it approached, it appeared bit by bit, and finally stepped out of the vortex and into the mortal world. 1 ray, 2 rays, 3 rays, a total of 5 figures appeared from the vortex. When the vortex disappeared, 5 figures stood on top of broken cloud top. These 5 were Chu Mu and his 4 slaves. As soon as they appeared, everyone trembled. Their faces changed greatly, and they were horrified. Close to 100,000 Shark Tribe soldiers and more than 300 saint contenders were all looking at them. The pressure brought by the stare was indescribable. It was like an ordinary person encountering a pack of wolves. "Master, this is bad," Merlin whispered. His face was very ugly, and his heart was trembling. Although he was a 5-star Grand Sword Saint, he could not help but shudder in the face of more than 300 saint contenders and close to 100,000 Shark Tribe soldiers. "I know," Chu Mu said in a grave tone. His face was also ugly. His thoughts turned quickly, and he analyzed the cause and effect. Soon, he came to an answer. It must be the fluctuation caused by the opening of the forbidden area that attracted the Shark Tribe soldiers, as well as the human saint contenders in the distance. Previously, Chu Mu had also thought that the fluctuations would attract the attention of others, but he did not expect it to be so serious. They had fallen into a tight encirclement. With just the 5 of them, it was impossible for them to fight against nearly 100,000 Shark Clan warriors, not to mention that there were also more than 300 Shark Clan saint experts. 2 of them were emitting auras that seemed to cause the world to tremble. At this time, the eyes of one of the 300 Shark race saints lit up. He flew to Sword Shark Li's side and said a few words. Sword Shark Li's gaze turned cold, like 2 sharp swords that wanted to pierce through Chu Mu, causing his scalp to feel numb. This was the pressure brought about by a 9-star saint. The current Chu Mu was able to fight against an ordinary 1-star saint, but the gap between him and a 9-star saint was just too big. It was like a firefly compared to the bright moon, or a drop of water compared to the vast ocean. Even if Sword Shark Li did not resist and just stood there and allowed Chu Mu to attack, Chu Mu's sword would not be able to cause any damage to him. This was the difference, the absolute difference. "Human, hand over everything you have," Sword Shark Li barked out coldly. "Master, his name is Sword Shark Li. He's a super powerful being of the Sword Shark race, a 9-star saint. He's extremely ferocious." When Fei whispered, he was one of the 2 3-star sword saints. As a sword saint, He naturally had the bearing of a sword saint. However, facing the army of the shark race and the shark race saint experts right now, their faces were extremely ugly. This was especially the case for Sword Sharkly, a super-powerful being with a ferocious reputation. A 9-star saint would be a top existence in every single race. There had not been anyone who surpassed the 9-star saint level for many years now. Even if there were, they would be in seclusion for various reasons. Trouble. This was a huge trouble. The joy of obtaining the inheritance was scattered in an instant. Now that things have come to this, I'll have to use up another chance. Chumu muttered to himself. There was no choice. There were too many shark race warriors. If there were only shark race warriors and no saint-level experts, Chumu would have some confidence in escaping. However, there were more than 300 shark race saint-level experts. There were low, middle, high, and even 9-star saint-level experts. With the strength of him and his slaves, there was no way they could fight back. There was no hope at all. Out of the 5 chances, he had already used up one. Now, he had to use up the second chance. Chumu had long known that the experts in the sword sect's spiritual seal were all experts who could fight across realms. For example, Bai Yi was at the peak of the 7th heaven of the Wangu realm. However, it didn't seem too difficult for him to kill the Purple Thunder Palace after they used a secret technique. He could even fight against an ordinary 8th heaven of the Wangu realm. In an instant, Chumu made his choice. With a thought, a figure silently appeared. That figure was like a shadow, between real and illusory. It was about 3 inches above the ground. His face couldn't be seen clearly. Even the outline of his body was blurry. In his hand was a pitch-black sword that seemed like a shadow. Shadow greets the young master. The blurry shadow-like person bowed to Chumu. His voice was erratic, and it was impossible to tell where it came from. The sudden appearance of Umbra immediately attracted everyone's attention. The gazes of the 300 shark species sacred rank experts all shifted away from Chumu and focused on Umbra. Chumu let out a sigh of relief. Being stared at by 300 saint-level experts definitely wasn't a good feeling. Dark shadow was like a shadow, giving people an unfathomable feeling. The sword in his hand had a dark and profound feeling to it. Sword addict Ling Fengxiao's expression changed greatly. His eyes shot out a terrifying light. He could feel an indescribable sword intent from Shadow's body. As for the 5-star sword Saint Merlin, the 3-star sword saints Wen Fei and Long Yi beside Chumu, their faces were lifeless. Their thoughts seemed to have frozen as they stared at Shadow. Shadow, can you kill them? Chumu asked. Shadow would only act for him once. Moreover, the Sea tribe was extremely arrogant. Even if they managed to escape now, they would definitely chase after them. Being chased by so many Sea tribe experts wasn't something fun. Naturally, if they could kill them, they would kill them. Chumu was also probing. If Shadow said he couldn't do it, then he would change his mind and have Shadow protect them as they left this place. As the young master commands. Shadow's voice was still erratic. There wasn't the slightest bit of hesitation, which shocked Chumu. Was it Shadow's arrogance? Or did he really have the strength? For no reason, Chumu's heart was beating wildly. His blood was boiling. Kill! A single word was uttered, filled with killing intent. Arrogant ants! A shark tribe saint-level contender roared. A high-level shark tribe saint-level contender reached out and grabbed. Countless water vapor gathered, forming a giant blue claw. It stretched forward and grabbed at Chumu and the others. A terrifying pressure erupted like a flash flood, pouring down in torrent. Chumu and the others' bodies stiffened, unable to move. Seeing that Chumu and the others were about to be caught by the giant blue claw, Shadow attacked in an instant. The sword in his hand slashed gently. There was no sword light, only a shadow, and the giant blue claw was defeated. Before they could be surprised, Shadow's entire body exploded, turning into a mass of black. Like ink splashing on a piece of paper, it quickly spread out. In the blink of an eye, it covered the surroundings. Sword Shark Li and Tiger Shark Jean's expressions changed drastically. The spreading darkness made them feel a strong sense of danger. Attack! The two of them roared in unison. A strange longsword appeared in Sword Shark Li's hand, while a thick broadsword appeared in Tiger Shark Jean's hand. They attacked with all their might. The sword shadows and broadsword light shattered the vacuum, but they disappeared into the darkness as if they had been devoured. The other Shark Tribe's Saint-level contenders all attacked. Close to 100,000 Shark Tribe warriors also attacked. Under the military formation, the power of their attacks was divided into two. One was like a giant sword shark breaking through the sky, and the other was like a giant tiger shark emerging from the sea. The momentum was shocking and the power was terrifying. A low-level saint would be crushed to pieces upon contact. The military formation of the Sea Tribe had always been very famous. Only the Sea Tribe could master it. The power of the military formation was extremely terrifying. However, the giant sword shark and tiger shark disappeared the moment they came into contact with the spreading darkness. There was not even a splash. The darkness quickly spread out in front of the thousands of human saint-level contenders, swallowing the light. All the attacks of close to 100,000 Shark Tribe warriors were devoured, including their bodies. 3 breaths. The entire process took less than 3 breaths, and the Shark Tribe army of close to 100,000 had disappeared into the darkness. The darkness covered an area of more than 20 miles. Many human saint-level contenders saw that something was wrong, and quickly retreated to avoid being covered by the darkness. What's this? How terrifying! The human saint-level contenders' faces changed greatly, and their hearts were still beating with fear. Sword domain. This is a sword domain. It's not an ordinary sword domain. Sword addict Ling Fengshao gripped the sword in his hand tightly. The light in his eyes was as bright as the sun, and waves of strong, sharp aura surged around him. Ling Fengshao was shocked. Chu Mu was also very shocked because he also felt that this was a sword domain. Moreover, it was not an ordinary sword domain, but a special and powerful sword domain that carried the power of darkness. Merlin, Wenfei, and Dragon Wing were equally shocked. Sword domain was the symbol of a peerless swordsman. Although the 3 of them were sword saints, they had not mastered a sword domain. That was the power they yearned for. This was not an ordinary sword domain, but a special and powerful sword domain. In the sword domain, I am the master. The Shark Tribe army of close to 100,000 was completely absorbed into the darkness sword domain. Those outside the darkness sword domain could not see or sense it. Some of the saint-level contenders tried to spread their mind power, intending to invade the darkness sword domain to investigate. In the end, they found that their mind power seemed to have been devoured, and they could not sense it at all. Chapter 1408. Darkness pervaded the surrounding void. Even the power of consciousness could not enter. This was the sword domain belonging to an Ing. He named it the Shadow Sword Domain, not the Dark Sword Domain. It was completely silent, so silent that it was frightening. Everyone stared at the darkness that covered over 20 li, as if it was eternal. Inside the Shadow Sword Domain was the world of an Ing. He was the master of the Dark Sword Domain. Incarnating into the darkness, blending into the darkness, he was everywhere. What is this place? A shark warrior roared. He could not see any of his companions around him, only himself. He could not hear any other sounds. Even his own roar sounded ethereal, as if it was coming from afar. It was very strange. His 6 senses were still there, not deprived. But even if he could see with his eyes, he could only see darkness. He could hear with his ears, but he could only hear his own voice. He could smell with his nose, but he could only smell his own breath. Suddenly, a shadow seemed to condense in the darkness. This shark saint-level expert did not notice it at all. A black sword light pierced out like a shadow, silently piercing the throat of the shark warrior. The terrifying power caused the shark warrior's body to shatter, and he died unknowingly. The same scene was happening to the other shark warriors. Within the Shadow Sword domain, Ying's ability was greatly enhanced. An ordinary sword domain only suppressed the opponent's strength and speed, and increased one's own strength and speed. In this way, one's strength could be clearly distinguished. However, the Shadow Sword domain was the result of Ying's painstaking efforts. In addition to having all the characteristics of an ordinary sword domain, it also had its own unique characteristic. In short, the biggest characteristic of the Shadow Sword domain was that the master of the sword domain could transform into thousands of shadows and be everywhere. Every shark warrior walked in the darkness, groping about. Some waved the weapons in their hands, attacking in all directions. It was as if they were stirring the void, but they did not even cause the slightest ripple. It was a waste of energy. An illusory shadow condensed not far away, appearing silently. Like a shadow, a sword slashed out. Without any warning, the shark warrior was killed. Within the Shadow Sword domain, the shadows could turn into tens of millions of shadows. In one move, 10,000 shark warriors had died. If the outside world knew about this, it was unknown how shocked they would be. It was like harvesting wheat. One sword for one life, one sword for one life. Silently, nearly 100,000 shark warriors were killed by the dark shadow. The entire process took less than 30 breaths of time. In the end, only 300 Shark Tribe Saint Realm experts remained. Logically speaking, since Chu Mu and the others were at the center, they should have been enveloped by the Shadow Sword domain. However, the strange thing was that the Shadow Sword domain avoided them, leaving a part of the area 10 meters around them empty. Chu Mu stared at the blackness in front of him. He released his spiritual sense to touch it, but it disappeared without a trace. He knew that this was a sword domain, but it was not something that the sword domain he had mastered could compare to. It was a special and even more powerful sword domain, perhaps something like the Dark Sword domain. However, Chu Mu couldn't figure out what it was. He didn't know how to obtain a similar sword domain. After all, his cultivation of the sword domain was only at the beginning. Once he stabilized it, it would be difficult for him to improve it. In any kind of cultivation path, it was best to have guidance. Without guidance, one could only fumble around on their own. This meant that one would have to take many detours and spend a lot of time and energy to make progress. Sometimes, even if one put in the effort, there might not be any gains. But if one had guidance, it would be different. There would be fewer detours and one could reach their goal faster. For example, if one wanted to go to a place, there would be a main road and countless winding paths. Those with guidance would have a map and would know how to travel faster. But those without guidance would have no map and could only fumble around on their own. Even if they walked into a bend, they would have to move forward for a while before discovering it. Then, they would have to turn back and move forward again. Chu Mu was currently cultivating the sword domain because he was facing such an awkward situation. Previously, he had been able to break through and grasp the sword domain not only because of his superb swordsmanship attainments, but also because he had personally experienced the power of the sword domain and directly understood its mysteries. But after that, he didn't have any clues and could only fumble around on his own. It was very difficult to make progress. If he could immerse himself in this black sword domain and personally experience it, it would certainly be of great help to his cultivation of the sword domain. It was just that Umbra was using the sword domain to envelop the shark race army. Chu Mu wasn't sure if he would affect Umbra if he rashly entered. The 300 shark race saint-level experts were the same as the shark race warriors. They could only see a stretch of endless darkness. Their ears could only hear their own voices and their noses could only smell their own breath. Come out, you cowardly humans. If you have the guts, come out and fight with me. A saint-level expert of the Shark clan activated his sea art. His entire body surged up and down like a tidal wave as he roared. It was as if he wanted to destroy everything. He roared continuously, but his voice seemed to be stretched out. It sounded distant and strange. No one answered him. Umbra simply didn't care about what he said. A shadow condensed behind him, and a sword pierced out. Without a sound, it pierced through the back of the shark race Saint-level expert's head. The terrifying power directly strangled his spirit and killed him. Soon, all the low-level shark race Saint-level experts, mid-level shark race Saint-level experts, and a portion of the high-level shark race Saint-level experts died under Umbra's sword. In the end, only a dozen or so high-level shark race Saint-level experts survived. Every high-level shark race Saint-level expert had a layer of blue cover on their body that emitted a faint blue light. This blue cover varied in size and size. It was the power of the domain that they had mastered. They used their own domain to resist Umbra's Umbra sword domain. But because of the obvious difference between the two domains, they were suppressed. Even the two 9-star Saint-level experts, Saber Shark Li and Tiger Shark Jean, could only extend their domain to a range of 1,000 meters before they were suppressed. They couldn't expand any further. However, the range of 1,000 meters was equivalent to the world that they had mastered. All changes were within their control. Was it useful to use their own domain to resist Umbra's sword domain? It was useless because the difference was too great. This kind of resistance was only to buy a little more time for them to survive. Umbra swung his sword. It was as though he was slicing a bubble. Following that, a shadow entered the shark race Saint-level expert's domain and slashed out. Die! The high-level shark race Saint-level expert reacted quickly. He slapped out with his huge palm, and the sound of waves and tsunamis surged. When the shadow was slapped, it began to shatter, turning into wisps that dissipated into nothingness. At the same time, a shadow sword pierced through the high-level shark race Saint-level expert's forehead, crushing his soul. In the end, another high-level shark race Saint-level expert died. Umbra could only deal with the weaker ones. Umbra couldn't kill a high-level shark race Saint-level expert who had mastered a domain. Other than Sword Shark Li and Tiger Shark Jean, the other high-level shark race saints who were still alive were all at the 8th celestial layer of the immemorial realm. Each of them had mastered a domain and could barely resist. However, the difference between them and Umbra was too obvious. Under Umbra's attack, they were killed one by one. In the end, only Sword Shark Li and Tiger Shark Jean were left. The domain that was 1,000 meters wide was instantly sliced apart silently. However, Sword Shark Li could feel that the moment the domain was sliced apart, the strange sword in his hand slashed out. It seemed to ignore the distance between them as the sword slashed towards the shadow that had just entered the domain. The shadow instantly shattered, but Sword Shark Li didn't have the slightest bit of joy. His body moved quickly, dodging the shadow's sword behind him. He was at the 9th celestial layer of the immemorial realm, and this was his domain. He had the strength to fight Umbra. Sword Shark Li's attack was launched. Unexpectedly, Sword Shark Li also had superb sword skills. Umbra's body shattered once again, turning into a black color that spread out. It was as if ink had dyed clear water. In the blink of an eye, Sword Shark Li's domain was filled. What is this? Sword Shark Li's tone was filled with fear. His advantage no longer existed. Dead. Only Tiger Shark Jean was left. Umbra's sword broke through Tiger Shark Jean's domain and entered it. Tiger Shark Jean's huge saber met him head-on. The saber light was as bright as a waterfall. It was breathtaking. It was like a 10,000-meter tall wave crashing down. It was extremely terrifying. Without much resistance, Umbra's body shattered under the bright saber light. He turned into a black color that spread out and filled Tiger Shark Jean's domain. This was a domain within a domain. It was a deeper application of a domain. Although Sword Shark Li and Tiger Shark Jean were powerful, they hadn't reached this level. Sword Shark Li died, and then Tiger Shark Jean also died. One man and one sword, an Ing slaughtered the army of the Shark clan. What happened? I can't see anything. I can't feel anything. The thousands of human race saint-level experts outside stared and waited. Time passed little by little. In less than a quarter of an hour, the black color began to fade. There's movement. What's the result? Suddenly, the fading black color accelerated. In the blink of an eye, it shrunk into a ball and wrapped Chu Mu and the others. It turned into a meteor and streaked across the sky, quickly flying into the distance. In the blink of an eye, it disappeared in front of everyone's eyes. One after another, corpses floated in the air. There were close to 100,000 of them. The thousands of human race saint-level experts felt their hair stand on end and chills run down their spines. They recognized that it was the Shark Clan army from before. Only a quarter of an hour had passed, but now all of them had turned into corpses that began to fall from the sky. It was like a rain of corpses that made the hearts and minds of thousands of saint-level experts tremble in fear. Chapter 1409. Some people's deaths would only be remembered for a moment. Some people's deaths would be remembered for a lifetime. Nearly 100,000 Shark Clan soldiers had died collectively. Their corpses fell like a torrential downpour, falling all around Broken Cloud Mountain. Corpses were densely piled up like a mountain. This scene was shocking to the eyes. It was deeply imprinted in the hearts of thousands of human saint-level experts. It was like a brand that they would never forget. And these corpses piled up like a mountain were only a foil to the strength of a person. A person whose appearance couldn't be seen clearly. His entire body was like a shadow of a sword saint expert. A sword that could stop 100,000 soldiers. That was just like the legends. A sword that could slaughter 100,000 soldiers. There were many saint-level experts among them. There were even 2 ferocious 9-star saint experts. When they recalled this scene in the future, they couldn't help but feel cold all over. They secretly rejoiced that they weren't enveloped by the Black Sword domain. Otherwise, they would be among the corpses that were piled up like a mountain. In the past, there had only been incidents of humans killing the sea race. However, there weren't many of them. In the last 100 years, it was even rarer to hear of such incidents. That was because the sea race was famous for their ferocity. And now, a sword that could slaughter 100,000 Shark Clan soldiers was a major incident. It was absolutely a major incident. When this news was spread out, those who heard it but didn't see it with their own eyes couldn't believe it. They even thought that the person who said this had a problem with his head. How dare he speak nonsense? However, it wasn't just one person who said this. There were many people. Moreover, the source of the news was a saint-level expert. With so many saint-level experts, everyone couldn't help but believe it. Therefore, many people specially rushed to Broken Cloud Mountain. What they saw was a field of corpses. It was a ghastly sight. Their hearts were beating wildly, almost jumping out of their throats. Their bodies were trembling in horror. It's actually true. 100,000 Shark Clan soldiers were all killed. It's said that the one who killed them was only a human sword saint. I heard that there were several hundred saint-level experts among the Shark Clan soldiers. There were even 9-star saint-level experts of the Sword Shark Clan and the Tiger Shark Clan. A man with a sword slaughtered 100,000 Shark Clan soldiers. What kind of glory is that? Good kill. The Sea Clan is tyrannical, while the Shark Clan is savage and ruthless. If I had such strength, I would have massacred the Shark Clan sooner or later. A youngster gnashed his teeth in anger. Lower your voice. If the marine race hears you, only death awaits you. The person beside him pulled him back and shouted in a low voice. His expression was quite unsightly. Who would be willing to submit to someone else, let alone a foreign race? Unfortunately, the Blue Sea was the territory of the Oceanic race. The Oceanic race was united and powerful. It wasn't something that the humans on the island could compare to. It was just like how the land was the world of humans. The Oceanic race simply wouldn't enter the land. The massacre of the Shark Clan army of 100,000 shocked many people, but at the same time, It also made many people happy. To think that the arrogant and tyrannical Shark Clan would have such a day. For the Shark Clan, the death of 2 9-star Saint-level experts was no small loss. Not to mention the death of several hundred Saint-level experts and close to 100,000 high-level Shark Clan warriors. It could be said that after this battle, the strength of the Shark Clan had dropped a little. A shocking amount of water vapor gushed out. On Lianyun Island, huge waves surged. They were hundreds of meters high, surging violently, as if they wanted to destroy everything. One after another, huge figures rushed out of the blue sea, bringing with them countless splashes. Those were giant sharks. Each of them was golden-gray in color, flickering with a metallic luster. Their ferocious appearance and ferocious eyes were all frightening. Black Gold Shark. It's the Black Gold Shark warriors of the Shark Clan, let's go. On the back of each golden-gray shark sat a member of the Sea Clan. They were from the Shark Clan. Their appearances were different from those of the Sword Shark Clan. They were closer to the Human Clan. They had an aura that the Sword Shark Clan didn't have. Their eyes were cold and sharp. Each of them held an incomparably sharp spear in their hands. Those spears were surrounded by an astonishing baleful aura. The Black Gold Shark at the front of the Black Gold Shark group had a deeper color and a larger body. The Shark Clan members sitting on it had a robust body. They wore a ferocious and domineering battle armor that was similar to the color of the Black Gold Shark's skin. They wore a sharp helmet that only revealed a pair of cold and emotionless eyes, looking down on the common people like ants. As soon as the Black Gold Shark warriors moved out, countless people were frightened. The Black Gold Shark was a powerful sea beast raised by the Shark Clan. There were not many of them because it was difficult to raise them. Therefore, only the Emperor Shark Clan, the royal clan of the Shark Clan, was qualified to use the Black Gold Shark as a mount. For this reason, the Emperor Shark Clan selected the experts of the Emperor Shark Clan to be the Black Gold Shark Knights, forming the Black Gold Shark Army. It could be said that the Black Gold Shark Army was the top fighting force of the Shark Clan. Each of them had the strength to kill ordinary Saint-level experts. Their commander was an expert among the 9-star Saint-level experts. Even Sword Sharkly Tiger Shark Jean was no match for him. If it were not for the 100,000 Shark Clan warriors who had died, the Black Gold Shark Army would not have been mobilized. The last time they were mobilized was in a great war hundreds of years ago. The Black Gold Sharks were extremely fast and powerful. Soon, they entered the Lianyun Island. Their speed did not decrease at all. They rampaged and ignored everything, rushing towards the Broken Cloud Mountain. Wherever they passed, many houses collapsed under the terrifying wind pressure. The streets were destroyed. Some humans were crushed under the wind pressure. Blood flowed like rivers. It was extremely miserable. 1,000 Black Gold Sharks galloped unhindered. They were tyrannical and caused great suffering. When the Black Gold Shark Army arrived at the Broken Cloud Mountain and saw the corpses strewn everywhere, their eyes emitted shocking killing intent. Baleful aura surged around them. The temperature in the air plummeted as if the world was frozen. The Black Gold Shark Army commander's eyes were cold and emotionless. He looked down at the 100,000 Shark Clan warriors' corpses, but there was not the slightest fluctuation in his eyes. With a flip of his palm, a mirror appeared. The mirror flew up and enlarged. It faced the ground and emitted a faint blue light. Amidst the buzzing sound, the light swept past the corpses of the 100,000 shark warriors. Then, the light retracted and became restrained. The Black Gold Shark Army commander, Shark Emperor, waved his hand. The bronze mirror flew back and shrunk. A light image appeared on the mirror. It was the scene of the Shark Clan army surrounding the Broken Cloud Mountain. Thousands of human Saint-level experts retreated. A whirlpool door appeared on the Broken Cloud Mountain. 5 figures appeared one after another. Then, a shadow-like figure appeared on the side. The shadowy figure exploded, turning into a blackness that covered a radius of more than 20 miles. The 100,000 Shark Clan warriors were all enveloped. None of them could escape. The blackness did not last for long before it shrunk. Then, it wrapped around the 5 figures. They turned into a stream of black light and flew away. In the blink of an eye, they disappeared into the horizon without a trace. Corpses floated in the air and fell down one after another, forming a mountain of corpses and a sea of blood below. The image in the mirror retreated and stopped at the scene where Chu Mu's group and the shadowy figure appeared. Shark Emperor's cold and emotionless eyes stared at the shadowy figure in the mirror. He knew very well that it was that shadowy figure who had slaughtered the 100,000 Shark Clan warriors. The aura he sensed through the mirror made him fearful. It also made his blood boil. A sense of invincibility and loneliness rose in his heart. Shark Emperor was the commander of the Black Gold Shark Army. He was a super expert at the peak of the 9-star Saint Realm. He was much stronger than Sword Shark Li and Tiger Shark Shan. He had dominated the Blue Sea and rarely had any opponent. He had been lonely for many years. Now that he saw an expert that even he was fearful of, he was extremely eager to fight with such an expert. Whether it was for his own purpose or for the revenge of the Shark Clan, he had to find that shadowy figure. Apart from the shadowy figure, Shark Emperor's eyes were fixed on Chu Mu's face. This was a Nirvana realm human. To him, Chu Mu was like an ant. He could kill Chu Mu with one breath. However, he would not let Chu Mu go. Anyone who was related to this matter, no matter who they were, must die. Pass down my order. Order all the human sects and forces on Lianyun Island to move out. They must find those people even if they have to dig 3 feet into the ground. Shark Emperor's voice was incomparably cold. It was impossible to find Chu Mu and the rest with just 1,000 Black Gold Shark Army. What the sea race liked to do the most was to use force to oppress the human race to deal with their own people. This way, the human race would understand that the sea race was not to be trifled with. In the Blue Sea, the sea race reigned supreme while the human race could only be a vassal. This was the definition of the sea race. After that, the 1,000 Black Gold Shark Army galloped away and visited all the major human sects on Lianyun Island. They didn't even let the Heavenly Saint cult off. The Heavenly Saint cult was the #1 human force on Lianyun Island. Naturally, they had the ability to contend against the 1,000 Black Gold Shark Army. They even had the ability to annihilate the Black Gold Shark Army. However, the consequence was that they had to suffer the loss of 800 of their own men. They also had to bear the wrath of the sea race. They couldn't afford to offend them or hide from them. Under the pressure of the Black Gold Shark Army, the Heavenly Saint cult could only compromise. They sent out the disciples and elders of the cult to sweep through Lianyun Island to find the whereabouts of Chu Mu and the rest. Heavenly Saint cult was so strong, yet they had already compromised, so the other sects and powers didn't dare to go against them. That was because the consequences of going against them were very obvious, and that was to be wiped out by the Black Gold Shark Army. There would be no survivors. Feeling aggrieved, they shifted their anger. If it wasn't for the fact that Chu Mu and the rest had slaughtered 100,000 Black Gold Shark Army, they wouldn't have to suffer such humiliation. The Heavenly Saint cult and the other sects and forces also gave out rewards. Anyone who could find the 6 of them would be rewarded handsomely. In an instant, almost the entire island was mobilized. They dug 3 feet into the ground to search for the traces of Chu Mu and the rest. On the other human islands, the same scene was also happening. On the sea, the entire shark race and the subordinate sea race were also mobilized. They galloped across the sea to search for the traces of Chu Mu and the rest. The situation became very tense. Once the traces of Chu Mu and the rest were discovered, they would have to face the wrath of the shark race and a storm of attacks. Chapter 14:10. The Sword Shark Tribe's Sword Shark Army galloped across the vast blue sea, riding the wind and breaking the wave. The commander of the Sword Shark Army, Sword Shark Jia, had a gloomy expression because Sword Shark Li, who was killed, was his brother and the vice commander of the Sword Shark Army. he swore that he would find the murderer and tear him into pieces with his own hands. Thousands of sword shark warriors swept across the sea, searching for the 6 murderers. They would not let any of them go, and the main culprit, the Shadow Man, was their primary target. Other than the Sword Shark Tribe's Sword Shark Army, the Tiger Shark Tribe's Tiger Shark Army was also mobilized. The Sword Shark Army and Tiger Shark Army were similar to the Black Gold Shark Army, but they were not as strong. Other than the army, the other Shark Tribe warriors were also mobilized, sweeping through the nearby sea. The other branches of the Shark Tribe, such as the Horned Shark and Spiral-Tooth Shark, were also mobilized. There were also subsidiary tribes such as the Swordfish Tribe, Giant Mouth Fish Tribe, and dozens of other sea tribes. Usually, the Blue Sea was calm, but at this moment, many sea tribes were patrolling back and forth, searching everywhere. They visited every island, big and small, in order to find Chu Mu and the others. The Blue Sea was the sea tribe's territory. They did not believe that the 6 humans could escape to anywhere. Chu Mu was unaware of all the changes that happened because he and the others were brought away from Broken Cloud Mountain by the Shadow Man. They left Lianyun Island and arrived at a small island that was thousands of miles away from Lianyun Island. This small island was only about 30 miles in diameter. There was a small forest and a few bald mountains that were less than 1,000 meters in height. There were no signs of human life, nor were there any birds or beasts. It was just like an abandoned island, a deserted island. The Shadow Man was not familiar with the Blue Sea, so it was not strange that he brought Chu Mu and the others to this place. The Shadow Man then disappeared before everyone's eyes. Only Chu Mu knew that the Shadow Man had returned to the Sword Sect's spiritual seal. At this point, 2 out of the 5 chances had been used. There were 3 chances left. One was for the 8th celestial stage, one was for the 9th celestial stage, and one was for Bai Ling, who was suspected to have the strength of a great emperor. However, in exchange for 1 chance, he had slaughtered 100,000 Shark Clan warriors. Among them, there were more than 300 Saint-level experts, and 30 to 40 high-level Saint-level experts. Among them, there were 2 9-star Saint-level experts. The moment Merlin and the others were taken away by Shadow, they also saw the corpses floating in the air. Even when they landed on the deserted island, they were still in shock, unable to regain their senses. "Master, I'm afraid that the Sea Tribe has gone mad, searching for us everywhere," Merlin said to Chu Mu in a low voice. When Fei and Long Yi's faces were solemn. They were not afraid of the Sea Tribe, but under normal circumstances, they would definitely not provoke the Sea Tribe. Now, it was no longer a matter of provoking them. Instead, there was an irreconcilable hatred between them and the Sea Tribe. "Are the few of you thinking of surrendering to the Sea Tribe and betraying me?" Chu Mu's lips curled into a strange smile. He glanced at Merlin and the others, and said unhurriedly. This sentence was like a bolt from the blue, causing the expressions of Merlin and the others to change greatly. The 1-star saint of the underworld god tribe also trembled all over. Previously, in the Forbidden Land, Chu Mu had forcibly enslaved them with White E's help, making them suffer. He also made them understand that they should obediently be his slaves and not be disloyal. Once they were disloyal, it would be detected by him, and then they would suffer a fate worse than death. "Absolutely not, Master," Merlin and the others hurriedly promised, swearing solemnly. In fact, they did not dare to do so now. Previously, they were tortured by Chu Mu. That kind of mental and spiritual pain was unbearable, and they did not want to go through it a second time. "If you were disloyal, you would already be dead," Chu Mu said indifferently. "Open up a temporary cave abode here and stay for a while to avoid the limelight." "Yes, Master." Merlin and the others did not dare to disobey. The 3 human Grand Sword Saints and the Tribe Saints worked together to open up the cave abode. Soon, a temporary cave abode was completed. It was very secretive. Chu Mu and the others entered the cave abode and cultivated on their own. Chu Mu also thought that this period would not be peaceful, but his understanding of the Sea tribe was still too little. It was only based on the records of some ancient books. If he knew that the Sea tribe was mobilizing and forcing the human tribe to help search for them, he would not be so calm. However, whether he knew or not, it was all the same because the current situation was not suitable for them to leave at all. First of all, they were not familiar with where this place was, and which direction to go to return to land. Once they left this place and went outside, it was very likely that they would encounter the Sea tribe and be discovered. The temporary cave abode was sealed by the underworld god tribe's saint-level underworld god tribe, hiding their aura and everything else. It would be difficult for ordinary saint-level contenders to discover it. In the temporary cave abode, Chu Mu lived alone. He closed his eyes and cleared his mind of distracting thoughts, trying to comprehend the sword domain that Shadow had displayed. After a day, he opened his eyes. The main reason was that he had not personally come into contact with the sword domain, so he did not know how powerful the sword domain was or what mysteries it contained. With a thought, numerous spatial rings appeared in front of Huang Xiaolong. Then, hundreds of spatial rings appeared in front of Huang Xiaolong. The previous owners of these spatial rings were the Shark race's Saint Realm experts. They were killed by Dark Shadow and taken away by Dark Shadow. As for the spatial rings of those high-level Shark race warriors, Dark Shadow disdained to collect them. What a pity! Chu Mu could not help but secretly sigh. If it were him, he would definitely collect all the spatial rings and not waste a single one. In any case, the high-level Shark tribe warriors were equivalent to the human Nirvana realm. They would more or less have some collection in their spatial rings. If it was just 1 or 2 or even 10, it was not a big deal. However, the problem was that there were nearly 100,000 of them. The spatial rings of nearly 100,000 high-level Shark tribe warriors were spared by Shadow just like that. There was nothing he could do about it. The high-level Shark tribe warriors were like ants in Shadow's eyes. He could kill them with a flick of his finger. When he killed the Shark tribe warriors, he had used the Thousand Shadows transformation technique to kill them in an instant. Only Saint-level experts were worthy of his attention. There was nothing he could do about it. There was a huge gap between the Saint level and the Saint level. Not to mention that Chu Mu had only asked Shadow to kill them. He had not asked Shadow to collect all the spatial rings. In any case, there were more than 300 spatial rings. Although it was a far cry from the nearly 100,000 spatial rings, they were still the spatial rings of Saint-level experts. Under normal circumstances, their collection would definitely be more abundant than the spatial rings of the high-level Shark tribe warriors. Perhaps some Nirvana realm experts had more wealth than some Saint-level experts, but they were in the minority after all. In the Sea Race army, such a situation was even more impossible. Looking at the 300 spatial rings in front of him, a thought flashed through Chu Mu's mind, but it was soon replaced by joy. Chu Mu's spiritual sense swept out, invading the 300 spatial rings in an instant. Ordinary cultivators could only use their spiritual sense to search through the spatial rings one by one. The more powerful ones could use their spiritual sense to search through multiple spatial rings at the same time. However, Chu Mu could directly split his spiritual sense into over 300 strands and search through the spatial rings. He had been unable to do this before, but he was able to do so now that he had improved a lot in the application of his spiritual sense. Searching through the collections of over 300 spatial rings at the same time meant that Chu Mu's mind had to accept over 300 strands of information at the same time. If a person's soul was not strong enough or his mental world was not stable enough, it was very likely that his mind would be thrown into disorder when receiving such a shock of information. Under his investigation, the contents of every spatial ring were quickly displayed in Chu Mu's mind. Chu Mu was not surprised by the contents of the space ring of the Saint-level expert from the Shark clan. He did not find it surprising either. It was very normal. Instead, it increased Chu Mu's wealth by several times. The contents of the space ring of the Shark Clan Saint Level Expert were much richer than the contents of the space ring of the Shark Clan Saint Level Expert. There were many treasures and herbs, which made Chu Mu very happy. The space ring of the Shark Clan Saint Level Expert was the least in number, but the contents of each spatial ring were 10 times more valuable than any space ring of the Shark Clan Saint Level Expert. The ones with the richest collection were undoubtedly the space rings of the 2 9-star Saint Level Experts, Sword Shark Li and Tiger Shark Jean. Their collection was obviously better than the other high-level Saint Level space rings. It could be said that the collection in the 2 9-star Saint Level space rings was better than the collection in the other high-level Saint Level Experts space rings. The blue sea was vaster and deeper than the land. It could be said that the blue sea contained more treasures than the land. It was a land of treasures, but correspondingly, the blue sea was also more dangerous than the land. The Sea Clan was the master of the blue sea. They could wander in and deep within the blue sea. Apart from some dangerous places that they dared not enter, they could reach most places and obtain many herbs and treasures. After checking over 300 spatial rings, Chu Mu retracted his divine remembrance. With a thought, an irregular crystal appeared in his hand. The surface of the crystal seemed to be blue, but also transparent. Inside it was a nearly solidified deep blue liquid. It was extremely deep and flawless. Looking at it, it was as if he was looking at the miniature of an ocean. If he listened carefully, he seemed to be able to hear the rise and fall of tides. Dense waves of water vapor spread from it. This is the sea's essence. Holding the irregular dark blue crystal, Chu Mu couldn't help but laugh. Previously, in the forbidden area, he had obtained the final inheritance from the Sword God's throne. The second half of the Sword Universe was a shocking secret technique. Cultivating the first layer required the assistance of a large number of treasures. Most of the treasures were relatively easy to obtain. For example, Chu Mu already had all of them. Only the 5 most precious treasures were the essence of the 5 elements. The wood form was one of the essence of the wood element of the 5 elements. Now that he had obtained the sea's essence, it was one of the essence of the water element. With the second essence and the other 3 essences, he could cultivate the first layer of the shocking secret technique. Chapter 14:11. The sky was blue and boundless. Sparse white clouds floated in the sky, carefree and without the slightest worry. The blue sea that stretched as far as the eye could see was magnificent and contained countless mysteries. The islands were densely packed like stars in the sky. A large group of swordfish tribe members flew over from afar. Their sharp heads easily broke through the barrier of the sea water, splashing up heavy white waves that split into 2 sides. This group of swordfish tribe members numbered in the hundreds. When they saw the deserted island, they rushed over, leaping out of the water and landing on the island. Search! The swordfish tribe leader gave the order, and the hundreds of swordfish tribe members scattered into groups of 3 to search the entire deserted island. The deserted island was not big, and the search was quickly completed. The swordfish tribe members did not find the temporary cave abode, and left one after another. They did not hold much hope for such a small deserted island. They would rather miss it than let it go. In less than 10 days, the swordfish tribe members first landed on the deserted island to search. Not long after they left, another group of human Nirvana realm cultivators came to search the island but left without finding anything. Then, another group of shark tribe members arrived. On the 11th day, the deserted island was destroyed. There was a loud rumble, and the entire island shattered. The temporary cave abode was not affected, but Chu Mu and the others knew that they could not stay here any longer. They had to leave. However, how could they leave? If they went out like this, they would be easily discovered and become targets. Master, my tribe has a secret skill that can change one's body shape, appearance and even aura, Netherflow said. We can cultivate it? Chu Mu asked. Did he mean that humans could cultivate the Nether God tribe's Nether God spell? I'm not sure. Master, you can try. Netherflow said, this spell is called meditation spell. A small success can change one's body shape and appearance. Deshang can change his aura. With that, Netherflow passed this spell to Chu Mu. After a moment of hesitation, he passed it to Merlin and the other two. Now they were grasshoppers on the same line. Meditation spell. After Chu Mu understood the content, he quickly read through it and found that there was a mystery in it. Different races had different cultures, which were created and accumulated bit by bit since the birth of the race. After countless years of development and reproduction, a complete and extensive cultural heritage was formed. The Underworld God art was created by the Underworld God clan. It was based on the Underworld God clan's culture, so it wasn't difficult for the Underworld God clan to understand it. However, for the humans who had never studied the Underworld God clan's culture, it was like reading a heavenly book. Even with Chu Mu's shocking perception, he still couldn't understand the meditation breathing technique. It was like a cloud in the clouds, hard to understand. If Chu Mu was like this, then there was no need to mention Merlin and the other two. They were completely confused. Ming Lu, explain the meditation technique in detail, Chu Mu said. Yes, master. Ming Lu began to explain in detail. This involved the Underworld God clan's culture. However, he could speak the human language and had some understanding of the human culture. Therefore, in his detailed explanation, he tried to explain it as closely as possible. However, there were still obvious differences between the cultures. Merlin and the other two were still confused. On the other hand, Chu Mu used his superior comprehension to combine the human culture and his own foundation from Ming Lu's detailed explanation. He compared and referred to it one by one, understanding it bit by bit. By the time Ming Lu finished explaining, Chu Mu had already understood 20%. This was a very good start. The broken deserted island also had its advantages. Even if other humans and sea creatures passed by, they would not stop for long. They would just take a look and sweep past with their divine sense. If they did not find anything, they would quickly leave. During this period of safety, it gave Chu Mu and the others an excellent time to study. Chu Mu gradually understood the meditation technique in the human way. 30%. 40%. Fortunately, the meditation technique was not some unfathomable underworld god technique in the underworld god tribe. It was a relatively common technique. After more than half a month, Chu Mu finally understood 90% of the meditation technique. However, he could not understand the remaining 10% no matter how hard he tried. This was because Chu Mu had never studied the underworld god tribe's culture. No matter how amazing one's comprehension was, without the accumulation of culture and foundation, one was ultimately like a rootless duckweed. Although he had understood 90%, it was enough because Chu Mu did not intend to delve into the underworld god tribe's culture. He only wanted to change his aura, appearance, and so on. This was enough. With the human culture and his own foundation, combined with the content of the meditation technique and 90% understanding, he finally created a new technique. Chu Mu named it breath training technique. The breath training technique had just been created, so it was naturally not as perfect as the meditation technique. However, it was enough for now. Chu Mu imparted the breath training technique to Mei Lin, Wen Fei, and Long Yi. This person was able to become a sword saint, so his talent and comprehension were not bad. Under Chu Mu's teachings, he quickly understood and learned the breath training technique. Ming Lu had the meditation technique, which was a bit more advanced than the breath training technique. Naturally, he did not need the breath training technique. When Ming Lu used the meditation technique, his aura suddenly changed. His original aura was cold and gloomy, but now it was somewhat peaceful. It was completely different. As for his appearance, the underworld god tribe had always been covered in a black robe and had never changed it. However, this time it had to be changed. Thus, Ming Lu changed his black robe into a gray robe. He no longer covered his head and wore a black mask on his face. The breath training technique was created by Chu Mu. No one had a better understanding of the breath training technique than him. There were even very few who were on par with him. Chu Mu's facial muscles changed, giving people a creepy feeling. As they squirmed, a face completely different from Chu Mu's appeared. It was a face that did not look handsome. It was a somewhat ordinary appearance. If he was placed in a crowd, he would belong to the masses and would not be eye-catching. Immediately after, his body also changed. He shrunk little by little. Although it was not much, it could still be clearly distinguished. His appearance was ordinary, his height was ordinary, and finally, his aura changed. Chu Mu's original aura had a feeling that it contained all things in the world, and it also contained a trace of the sharpness of a sword cultivator. Now, after the change, his aura was a kind of simple aura. There was a trace of heaviness in the simplicity. Even those who knew Chu Mu would never associate this person with Chu Mu when they saw him now. Following that, Merlin and the other two also used their breath training techniques to change the shape of their faces and bodies. Finally, they changed the fluctuations of their auras. They were different from before. What was left was their cultivation base. Chu Mu's cultivation base was at the 7th level of the Nirvana realm. The meditation technique De Shang changed his aura. In addition to the fluctuations of his aura, it could also change the strength of his cultivation base's aura. Chu Mu set it at the 5th level of the Nirvana realm. Merlin used his breath training technique to fix his cultivation base at the 4th level of the Eternal realm, while Wen Fei and Dragon Wing fixed their cultivation bases at the 2nd level of the Eternal realm. As for Netherflow, it was difficult to lower his saint-level aura unless there was some special suppression. Therefore, his aura fluctuations were still at the 1st level of the Eternal realm. However, it was the kind of aura that was not stable since he had just broken through. Their appearances and auras had been changed. Originally, there were still Shadow, so there were 6 of them. Now, Shadow was gone, and there were only 5 of them. The number of people was different, their appearances were different, and their auras were different. If they were still recognized, then there was no other way. After all, Chu Mu could not hide in this broken island forever. He had other things to do. After all the changes, they checked the outside world. There were no auras nearby, so the 5 of them immediately left the temporary cave abode. They destroyed the cave abode and removed all the seals around it. "Let's go," Chu Mu said. The 5 of them immediately chose a direction and turned into streams of light, quickly leaving the broken island. The speed of the 5 people was maintained at the level of the Nirvana stage. It wasn't fast, but it wasn't slow either. In the blink of an eye, they were like 5 shooting stars that swiftly streaked across the azure sky. They flew across the deep azure sea and flew towards the nearest large island. This island was called Xiuhuang Island. It was a smaller island than Lianyun Island, but its surface area was relatively large. At this time, Xiuhuang Island was like the other islands and was under martial law. Anyone who entered or left the island had to be interrogated to prevent Sea Tribe fugitives from sneaking in and hiding, which would bring harm to the island. When Chu Mu and the others arrived and landed, they were surrounded before they could enter the island. The portraits and information about Chu Mu and the others had already been spread out. Apart from the fact that Chu Mu came from the mainland, the information about the 5-star sword Saint Merlin, the 3-star sword Saint Wen Fei, and Long Yi could be said to be very detailed. As for Ming Lu, there was very little information. No one even knew that he was not human. "You, take off your mask." A group of humans surrounded Chu Mu. Looking at their clothes, they seemed to belong to some sect. They were all Nirvana realm cultivators. They carefully sized up Chu Mu and the others. Their appearances and auras were different from the fugitives in the information they had. It should not be them. However, when they saw Ming Lu's mask, they still spoke arrogantly. This was not the time to cause trouble. Ming Lu took off his mask. It was an ugly face. It was a face that had been changed by the meditation technique. It was not Ming Lu's original face. Remember, once you enter Chihuang Island, don't cause trouble. Otherwise, you will only have yourself to blame if you are killed. Seeing that he couldn't find them, the person waved his hand and said impatiently, allowing Chu Mu and the others to enter Chihuang Island. Chu Mu and the others naturally wouldn't argue with him. They wanted as few people to pay attention to them as possible. Why would they want to start a conflict with others? That would be very unwise. After successfully entering Chihuang Island, they didn't stay for long and quickly left. They planned to leave Chihuang Island on a large flying ship and return to the mainland as soon as possible. As long as they returned to the mainland, even if their identities were exposed, the Sea Tribe wouldn't be able to do anything. This was because the mainland was the territory of the humans. Chapter 14:12. After a month, the culprit who slaughtered 100,000 Shark Clan warriors was still nowhere to be found. This caused the Shark Clan's anger to soar. They continued to search for the culprit, pressuring the human race. The human race's pressure increased greatly, but their search was fruitless. Just as Chu Mu and the others entered Chihuang Island, several rays of light tore through the blue sea and flew over. When they passed by the broken island, they suddenly stopped and landed on the broken island. Shockingly, they were several saint-level experts of the Shark Clan. This place is strange. Someone opened up a temporary cave residence here. It's just a barren island, but someone actually opened up a temporary cave residence here. This aura fluctuation shows that the temporary cave residence wasn't opened for long. It was just recently destroyed. These saint-level experts were all high-level saint-level experts. Their strength was extraordinary, and their abilities weren't to be underestimated. They immediately saw through the traces of the cave residence that had been opened not long ago. Although Chu Mu and the others were very cautious, they couldn't do anything about it. The difference in cultivation realm was too great. They erased some traces that they couldn't discover themselves, but some high-level saint-level experts with special abilities might be able to discover them. The approximate time of opening, the approximate time of destruction, the layout of the seal, and other traces left behind were all discovered by them. There's a total of 5 people, not 6. The strongest aura is only at the 4th layer of the eons. It's different from the aura fluctuations of the 6 murderers. Although it's different, it's still suspicious. These people are heading in the direction of Chihuang Island. Immediately go to Chihuang Island and search. With that said, the Shark Clan's several high-level Saint Realm Masters immediately flew towards Chihuang Island. They were high-level Saint-level experts, so their flying speed was extremely fast. It was far faster than Chu Mu and the others. One had to admit that the meditation technique and breathing technique were really good. They actually managed to hide from the senses of these high-level Saint-level experts. They didn't let them discover that it was Chu Mu and the others. However, it wasn't a good thing for them to be suspicious now. Chihuang Island did not have any flying ships that could directly reach the mainland. They had to pass through other islands that were closer to the mainland. Therefore, Chu Mu and the others planned to depart from Chihuang Island and head to other islands. On a ship-shaped flying ship, Chu Mu was in it, heading towards Lianyun Island. He had arrived at Lianyun Island from the inland, and this time, he was going to return to the inland from Lianyun Island. Ming Lu, Merlin, Wenfei, and Long Yi did not travel with Chu Mu because Chu Mu had ordered them to find a way to leave the Blue Sea and enter the interior of the Azure Wave Dynasty to reach the True Sword sect. If they arrived before Chu Mu, they would bring the disciples of the True Sword sect to participate in the Azure Wave Dynasty's myriad sects meeting. Chu Mu had also told them in detail about the location of the True Sword sect. As for Ming Lu, the mission Chu Mu gave him was to gather the geniuses of the Underworld God Clan and search for the Deep Blue Sacred Orb. The first task was to gather the geniuses of the Underworld God Clan and capture them all at the right time. The second task was to search for the Deep Blue Sacred Orb. It would be best if they could obtain it and hand it over to Chu Mu. The 5 of them acted together. In particular, there were 4 saint-level powerhouses among them. None of them were ordinary saint-level. Their combined strength was formidable, and even a 6-star saint-level could contend against them. It seemed safer. It was true that more people meant more strength. However, the more people there were, the easier it would be to be discovered. Once they were surrounded, it would be very dangerous, and death would be inevitable. Chu Mu's purpose of enslaving these people was clear. Ming Lu was a chess piece to be used against the underworld god clan, and was considered quite important. Merlin and the other 2 were saint-level grand swordmasters, 1 5-star and 2 3-star. They were quite extraordinary, and were used to strengthen the strength of the true sword sect. After all, Bai Ling had previously asked Chu Mu to develop the true sword sect and recreate the glory of the true sword sect as much as possible. From the current perspective of the true sword sect, even if they had many swordsmanship inheritances, it would not be so easy to develop. A few hundred years was not a long time, and 1,000 years was not surprising. After all, even if they had the inheritances, they still needed talents to accept them. Only when a sufficient number of talents accepted the inheritances, cultivated, and became stronger, could the sect expand. A few hundred years or 1,000 years was nothing to many saint-level contenders because the lifespan of an eternal realm saint-level was extremely long. The shortest was more than 100,000 years. However, a few hundred years or 1,000 years was very long for Chu Mu. He had only cultivated for a few hundred years. In a few hundred years, he did not know what level his cultivation would reach. However, the eternal realm was certain, and he did not know what level his strength would reach, but it should not be weak. Strength was a matter for later. How to develop the true sword sect better and faster was the most important. It was unrealistic to let Chu Mu slowly accumulate and develop over a long period of time. Therefore, there was only one way, and that was to attract more sword cultivators to join. Doing so had both advantages and disadvantages. The advantage was that it could quickly accumulate sword cultivators and strengthen the strength of the sect. The disadvantage was that these sword cultivators joined halfway, and were not disciples cultivated by the true sword sect, so their sense of belonging was not as strong. However, as long as they joined the true sword sect and accepted the inheritances, their sense of belonging would naturally increase slowly. Merlin, Fei Longyi, and the others were all outstanding sword cultivators. Chu Mu naturally hoped that they could work for the true sword sect and strengthen it. With powerful sword cultivators in charge, the true sword sect's strength would increase. After the grand meeting of the 10,000 sects, its reputation would be even more resounding. At that time, more geniuses would join the true sword sect as disciples, forming a good start. The flying ship rapidly flew in the direction of Lianyun Island. Chu Mu was in it and could sense the auras of Ming Lu, Merlin, and the others. This was the perception that came from the slave seal. Even Yang Zhen, who was far inland in the true sword sect, could still sense it. It was just that it was too far away, so it was not as clear. Suddenly, a tyrannical mind power swept over from the distance like a thunderstorm, unbridled and ignoring everything. The mind power swept over like a thunderstorm. Everyone on the flying ship paled and their bodies swayed. Caught off guard, their minds seemed to have been struck by lightning. They spat out mouthfuls of blood and their faces paled. The sudden sweep of the mind power shocked Chu Mu. Before he could react, his mind world trembled. The divine light will that seemed like a pillar connecting the mind world to the heavens shone brightly. The 2 sword souls also trembled. Sword intent spread out, stabilizing the mind world and resisting the sweep of the mind power. Fortunately, the sweep of the mind power was not particularly targeted. It was only looking for something and did not go all out. Otherwise, the mind world of everyone on the flying ship would have been shattered. Even Chu Mu was no exception. Although Chu Mu's soul was far stronger than others of the same level and his mind world was more solid, compared to a high-level martial saint expert, the difference was still too great. Suddenly, a strong sense of danger rose from the bottom of his heart and swept through his entire body. Chu Mu's hair stood on end and his mind world was in turmoil. This feeling made Chu Mu's expression change drastically. There was no need to think too much because there was no time for that. In an instant, Chu Mu took out the purple thunderbolt and entered it in a flash. He did not care about the damage to the flying ship and directly launched it at its maximum speed. With a roar, the purple thunderbolt turned into a bolt of purple lightning. It was extremely fast and instantly broke through the house of the flying ship. It ignored the seal and directly broke through it and quickly left. He did not dare to stay any longer because the longer he stayed, the more dangerous it would be. Chu Mu could not gamble his life on whether the other party was looking for him or not. In fact, there was no need to gamble. He was almost certain that the owner of the mind power was looking for him. Sure enough, the moment the purple thunderbolt burst out at its maximum speed, the owner of the mind power immediately locked onto the purple thunderbolt. Don't even think about escaping. A cold snort sounded. Immediately after, several figures rapidly approached and passed by the flying ship, quickly chasing after the purple thunderbolt. They were almost certain that the person they were looking for was inside the flying ship like a bolt of purple lightning. Although they did not know why the aura was different, they were almost certain that it was him. The purple thunderbolt burst out at its maximum speed. It was very fast, faster than an ordinary low-level martial saint. It was also somewhat unexpected. In the blink of an eye, it was quickly far away. The several martial saints of the Shark clan were all high-level martial saints. However, when they released their mind power, they were quite a distance away from Chu Mu. Even though they were very fast, they still needed some time to catch up. The moment they caught up with the flying ship, Chu Mu's purple thunderbolt was also getting farther and farther away from the flying ship. This was also related to the temper of the Shark clan's saint-level experts. They felt that the Blue Sea was the territory of the Sea race, and the Sea race could act unscrupulously. Especially for saint-level experts like them, they were even more unscrupulous when facing humans. That flying ship was obviously a flying ship of the human clan. Naturally, they would not take it seriously. Their mind power swept across without restraint, not hesitating to damage the spiritual world of many humans on the flying ship. If the human clan was strong enough to make the Sea tribe wary, these high-level martial saints of the Shark clan would not be so cautious. All of this was because the human clan was not strong enough. The humans on the flying ship all looked very ugly. Some even fainted and fell to the floor, motionless, their breaths weak. Damn the Sea tribe! Some people clenched their fists and secretly gnashed their teeth. However, they felt helpless. The human clan here was weak and could not be compared to the Sea tribe. This was mainly because the human clan was not as united as the Sea tribe. If the human clan was very united, even if the Sea tribe was stronger than the human clan, they would not be so unscrupulous. Several high-level martial saints of the Shark clan quickly chased after Chu Mu, leaving a few straight and long tracks in the void. Their figures disappeared before everyone's eyes. Chapter 14:13. A chase ensued in the vast blue sea. The purple thunderbolt was like a bolt of purple lightning as it streaked across the sky. Then, an incomparably sharp roar resounded, as if a sharp sword had sliced open the void and left a crack. After a few breaths, 4 blue figures with different colors tore through the sky like meteors and chased closely after the purple thunderbolt. Powerful auras spread out from these 4 figures without restraint, like a world-destroying storm. Everywhere they passed, the sea water below surged into the sky, and huge waves surged. These 4 figures were the high-level saint-level experts of the Shark clan who were chasing after Chu Mu. Previously, they had already suspected Chu Mu. After locking onto him, they planned to capture him and interrogate him. At that time, regardless of whether he was telling the truth or not, he would most likely lose his life. Chu Mu couldn't take such a risk. He also didn't want to rely on the peerless sword saint in the sword sect's spiritual seal to defend and kill his enemies every time. If he could deal with something, he would deal with it himself. Even if he was facing a high-level saint-level expert, if he could contend against one or two of them, it would be a tempering that couldn't be described with words. This was also why cultivators with the heart of an expert wouldn't bother with the weak unless it was absolutely necessary. They would only challenge those stronger than themselves. Fighting with experts could temper one's body and mind, temper one's path, and make oneself stronger. This time, Chu Mu planned to use his own ability to escape from the pursuit of the 4 high-level saint-level experts of the Shark Clan. If he could succeed, it would have a great tempering effect on his essence, chi, and spirit. If he couldn't, he could only use one more chance to kill these 4 high-level saint-level experts. The Purple Thunderbolt's speed wasn't slow. Regardless of the cost, it could exceed ordinary low-level saint-level experts. It was even faster than some mid-level saint-level experts. However, in the end, it was still inferior to high-level saint-level experts. Although the 4 high-level saint-level experts weren't proficient in speed, they were still faster than many mid-level saint-level experts. Previously, Chu Mu had taken the initiative to successfully escape. Now, however, the 4 great shark species sacred rank experts were constantly catching up and getting closer. According to this situation, it probably wouldn't be long before the 4 great shark species high-stage sacred rank experts caught up to Chu Mu. When that time came, Chu Mu would be surrounded and captured. He would have no choice but to use this opportunity. Thinking rapidly, Chu Mu's eyes flashed as he made a decision. He took a deep breath. In an instant, he controlled the Purple Thunderbolt to go even higher than its limit. Its speed doubled again as it shot forward, emitting strong purple lightning that spread all around and disturbed the void. With a sudden burst of speed, the distance between them and the 4 saint-rank saints was pulled apart. Just as they were about to burst forth with speed again, the Purple Thunderbolt suddenly reversed direction and charged towards the 4 saint-rank saints with a decisive aura. Advancing courageously, vowing to die without regret. The moment the Purple Thunderbolt charged towards the 4 high-level saint-level experts, Chu Mu quickly left the Purple Thunderbolt. In the past, he couldn't do this. Under such extreme speed, he had to leave in an instant. However, now that he had become one with the ship, he could easily do it. The Purple Thunderbolt was extremely valuable, but now Chu Mu wanted to explode it. He wanted to use the power of the Purple Thunderbolt's explosion to bombard the 4 high-level saint-level experts of the Shark Clan. He didn't want to kill them. He only wanted to obstruct them for a moment, giving him a chance to escape. The speed of the 4 saint experts was extremely fast, but the Purple Thunderbolt was also very fast. In just a moment there was no time to think. An incomparably intense purple light burst forth, and a terrifying explosion resounded, shaking heaven and earth. In an instant the world lost its color. Only endless purple filled the sky. The purple light that filled the sky was formed by lightning. It densely covered an area of tens of thousands of miles. It was like a sea of purple lightning that resonated with the deep blue sea below. It was a terrifying explosion. The self-destruction of the Purple Thunderbolt was comparable to the self-destruction of a mid-level saint. Even a high-level saint wouldn't dare to underestimate such a power. They would have to be cautious when dealing with it. The explosions were incessant, as if lightning from the 9 heavens had struck. Wherever the purple light passed, everything seemed to be destroyed, shattered, and annihilated into nothingness. Even from thousands of miles away, one could feel the violent fluctuations. Looking from afar, the purple light filled the sky, as if it had pierced through the sky and connected the sky to the sea. It was an unforgettable scene. What's going on? What a terrifying power! It's at least the full blow of a high-level saint-level expert. The power of a mid-level Saint-level expert's explosion was naturally far greater than the full blow of a mid-level Saint-level expert. It was comparable to the full blow of an ordinary high-level Saint-level expert. Which high-level Saint-level experts are having a life-and-death battle. Unless it was a life-and-death battle, they wouldn't go all out. Damn it. The 4 high-level Saint-level experts of the Shark Clan had a drastic change in expression. They were extremely fast. It wasn't easy for them to stop at full speed. The Purple Thunderbolt's speed was also extremely fast. Moreover, the explosion was so sudden that they weren't prepared for it. The huge explosion caused purple light to fill the sky. The terrifying purple lightning struck in an instant. The explosion was thousands of meters above the sea, but thousands of meters was too short. With a loud rumble, the vast surface of the sea was struck by an invisible force and collapsed downwards. The collapse was like a basin that spanned more than 100,000 meters, and the center of the basin had collapsed by several hundred meters. Under the pressure of the terrifying invisible force, the entire collapsed surface of the sea was like a huge sapphire that had been polished. The 4 high-level Saint-level experts of the Shark Clan unleashed their full power to resist the explosion of the Purple Thunderbolt. They had no time to care about Chu Mu. As for Chu Mu, he had already left the Purple Thunderbolt and rushed down at his fastest speed. He knew that if he went in any direction, it would be very difficult for him to escape the range of the explosion with his current speed. If he couldn't escape, there would only be 2 outcomes: death or serious injury. If he chose to go down and dive into the sea, he would be able to use the power of the sea to resist the explosion and weaken the impact of the explosion to a certain extent. Even so, before he dived into the sea, he could feel a terrifying force exploding and rushing down. A wisp of aura caused his body to tremble. It was as if an invisible force had hit his back, causing him to fall rapidly. With a loud boom, it was as if a meteor had fallen into the sea. The sword light split the pressure of the sea and quickly dived down. Chu Mu only felt that the pressure of the sea around him had suddenly increased. It was as if it had become an iron plate that was constantly pressing down from above. It was as if his body was going to become a meat patty. If it weren't for his body being so strong, he really would have become a meat patty. Under this terrifying pressure, Chu Mu's diving speed greatly slowed down. He almost stopped. The power in his body exploded. His body shook, and the sky-beheading sword appeared in his hand. Wherever his heart willed, the sword would follow. The sharp sword light broke through the sea that was as solid as an iron plate, creating a crack. Chu Mu immediately dived in. The sky-beheading sword slashed out again and again. It was as if Chu Mu was digging a hole in the sea. The immense pressure invaded his body, causing Chu Mu's muscles and bones to ache. It was as if his muscles were being torn apart. It was very uncomfortable. Fortunately, he had chosen to dive into the sea. He had used the sea to block most of the impact of the Purple Thunderbolt's explosion. Although he was being pressured by the sea, it was still better than being directly impacted by the explosion outside. Chu Mu was almost certain that if he was outside, he would most likely die from such an explosion. Even if he didn't die, he would be severely injured. He attacked with all his strength. Sword slash after sword slash, opening up an escape route. Every sword slash contained Chu Mu's essence, chi, and spirit. Gradually, Chu Mu entered a state where he didn't have to think. His attacks were all based on instinct. Gradually, the comprehension he had gained in the forest of 10,000 sword steels in the forbidden area of the True God Sword sect was integrated and displayed bit by bit. The trajectory of every sword slash became more mysterious. The power of every sword slash became more powerful. Unknowingly, it increased bit by bit. The pressure on his body could no longer be felt. It didn't disappear, but Chu Mu had forgotten about it. After an unknown amount of time, he slashed out again. This time, it was resolute, domineering, and sharp. It cut through everything, ignoring all obstacles. No matter if it was a god or a demon, they were all killed under the sword. With one slash, the pressure suddenly dissipated. That terrifying sharp sword light struck the bottom of the sea, illuminating the deep and dark sea. It was like a sudden clap of thunder across the dark sky. Chu Mu woke up and felt that the powerful pressure around him had disappeared without him knowing. He was now in the dark and cold deep sea. The original pressure of the sea water was assaulting him from all directions. In this place, he could not breathe any air. Suddenly, he felt uncomfortable. He was not used to it. After all, humans lived on land. With a thought, a light blue bead appeared in Chu Mu's hand. That bead emitted a faint light that spread out, covering Chu Mu's body. Immediately, the pressure of the deep sea was pushed away. Chu Mu could also breathe air. This feeling was very good. Actually, with his cultivation, it didn't matter if he breathed or not. It was just that humans needed to breathe from birth. After so many years, it had already become an instinct. This light blue bead was a secret treasure that Chu Mu had obtained from Taigashark Zhan's spatial ring. It was called the water avoidance bead. Its use was to enter the deep sea and isolate the sea from the pressure. It was extremely useful for humans. It was also useful for some sea races. After all, there were some dangerous places in the blue sea where the pressure of the sea was greater than other places. It wasn't something that all sea races could withstand. Chapter 14:14. In the sky above the blue sea, purple light flashed and thunder rumbled, covering a radius of tens of thousands of meters. It gradually shrunk, but looking at the speed of shrinking, it would take a long time, at least dozens of days, for everything to return to normal. 4 figures dashed out of the purple lightning sea, leaving in the blink of an eye. The 4 high-level saint-level experts of the Shark clan were in a sorry state. Their bodies were burned by the lightning after the explosion of the purple thunderbolt. Fortunately, they reacted quickly and used their energy to defend themselves. Even so, they were still slightly injured. Anger, incomparable anger. The 4 saint-level experts of the Shark clan were incomparably furious. The 4 of them had been tricked, causing them to be injured and lose face. This kid must be one of the 6. He must be one of the 6. He has already gone to the bottom of the sea. We must catch him to vent our anger. Humph, the sea is the territory of the Sea clan. We are the rulers. A mere human dares to dream of escaping from the sea. What a joke. Chase, we must not let this kid go. I want to skin him alive and pull out his tendons. The 4 saint-level experts of the Shark clan roared furiously. Their tyrannical spiritual energy swept out, like an invisible tide, rushing into the blue sea. Their speed increased rapidly as they entered the blue sea. The Sea clan was born in the sea, so they were naturally close to the sea. Their blood merged with the sea. Therefore, their spiritual energy and spiritual energy were also close to the sea. In the air, the spiritual energy and spiritual energy of the Sea clan were not as strong as that of the human clan. However, in the sea, the spiritual energy and spiritual energy of the Sea clan were much stronger than in the air or on land. As soon as the spirit power of the 4 Shark clan high-level saint-level experts entered the sea, it rapidly spread out. Its speed was almost twice as fast as it was in the air, and the range it could spread over was also much wider. However, there's nothing? How can there be nothing? I saw that damned human diving into the sea with my own eyes. How can there be nothing? That damned human must still be in the sea. He must have used the time when we were resisting the lightning to escape. However, with his Nirvana realm speed, it's already his limit to escape from the range of our spiritual energy. The sea is our territory. We are the rulers. Enter the sea and we will be able to sense that damned human. Enter the sea. Immediately, the 4 Shark clan high-level Saint Realm experts dove into the sea, leaving only purple lightning in the sky. The only ones who had sensed the abnormality of the aura on this desolate island were these 4 high-level saint-level experts of the Shark clan. Chu Mu and the others had also spread out. The four of them were only chasing after Chu Mu alone. Now that Chu Mu had detonated the purple thunderbolt to stop them while he dove into the sea to escape, the four high-level saint-level experts of the Shark Clan were furious. They ignored the others and chased after Chu Mu to capture him alive. As a result, Minglu, Merlin, and the other two were given a chance to escape. As soon as the four Shark Clan high-level saint-level experts entered the sea, their divine sense spread out once more, sweeping through the surroundings. However, they still couldn't find Chu Mu. However, they were very confident because the sea was the Sea Tribe's territory. The four Shark Clan saint-level experts immediately spread out and searched in four different directions. Under the protection of the water avoidance bead, Chu Mu continued to sink. He estimated that with the power of the purple thunderbolt's self-detonation, it would be difficult to kill the four Shark Clan high-level saint-level experts. However, it would cause them some trouble. After that, they would definitely chase after him in anger. In the sea, Chu Mu found it difficult to determine his direction because he was a human and not a member of the Sea Tribe. He was not familiar with the sea at all. If he randomly chose a direction, he did not know where he would end up. If he kept going deeper into the sea and away from land, it would be even more difficult to return. Therefore, Chu Mu chose to sink. The place he had entered was very, very deep and gradually sank. It seemed to be a narrow trench. Trenches were a kind of terrain in the depths of the sea. Some trenches were very short and shallow, only a few dozen meters deep, but some trenches were like abysses, thousands or tens of thousands of meters deep or even deeper. In the sea, the deeper one went, the greater the pressure of the sea would be. Moreover, it would be darker and colder. The temperature at the bottom of the sea was extremely low, but it would not freeze. However, if someone with insufficient cultivation entered, not to mention whether they could withstand the terrifying pressure, just the trace of coldness would be enough to kill them. Even the soul would be frozen, let alone the body. Fortunately, Chu Mu had the water avoidance bead. It was because of the water avoidance bead that he dared to enter the depths of the sea. Yes, the Blue Sea was indeed the territory of the Sea Tribe. However, not all members of the Sea Tribe dared to enter the depths of the sea. For example, the land was the territory of the human tribe. However, there were some dangerous and forbidden areas that the majority of the human tribe did not dare to enter. After entering the trench, although it was not wide and could even be called narrow, it was only a few meters wide and would not attract attention. However, to Chu Mu's surprise, the trench was very deep. He had already dived hundreds of meters, but he still could not see the end. Looking down, it was completely dark. Even with Chu Mu's eyesight, he could only see a few dozen meters away. All of a sudden, Chu Mu had a strange feeling. It was as if something in the depths of the trench was calling out to him. It was a familiar yet strange feeling, causing the divine light will in his spiritual world to gradually shine brighter. Could there be something in the depths of the trench that is closely related to the divine light will? Chu Mu continued to dive. His eyes flashed as he guessed. Soon after, as if he had thought of something, his eyes shone even brighter. Could it be? Chu Mu could not be sure whether it was that thing or not. He was not certain, but there was a slight possibility. If it was, then he would obtain a great benefit this time. As for what kind of benefit it was, he did not know, but it would definitely be beneficial to him. With this motivation, Chu Mu's diving speed seemed to have increased a little, but it was still quite slow because the pressure from the outside world was too great. Even though he could not feel it with the help of the water avoidance bead, it was a fact that the pressure on the water avoidance bead was increasing. It was because of Chu Mu's continuous diving that the four Shark Clan high-level saint-level experts did not discover him. Because they were searching in a horizontal direction, they thought that Chu Mu, a mere human Nirvana realm expert, had entered the sea to avoid their detection and escape. However, they did not expect that the sea was the domain of the Sea Tribe, and a mere Nirvana realm expert could not possibly enter the depths of the sea. One must know that there were places at the bottom of the sea that even high-level saint-level experts like them did not dare to enter. Since their thoughts were wrong, the direction of their search was naturally wrong as well. As Chu Mu continued to dive deeper, it became harder to find him. Diving down, continuing to dive down, continuously diving down. Suddenly, a light and crisp cracking sound rang out. It entered Chu Mu's ears, causing his expression to change slightly. A crooked crack appeared on the protective shield emitted by the water avoidance pearl. The water avoidance bead was indeed able to resist the pressure from the deep sea, but it was not omnipotent. There was a limit to it. When the pressure reached its limit, the water avoidance bead's protective barrier would crack, and if the pressure exceeded its limit, the protective barrier would shatter. Thinking about it, in this kind of deep-sea trench, once the water avoidance bead's protective barrier was shattered, Chu Mu's body would be crushed into dust by the terrifying pressure of the deep sea. Even his soul would be frozen by this horrifying frigid cold, sinking here for eternity, sinking into oblivion. Chu Mu hesitated. If he continued to dive, there was no guarantee that the water avoidance bead's protective barrier would shatter. At that time, what awaited him would be death. If he did not continue to dive, he would miss an opportunity. He could feel that the calling was very, very close. Making a decision, Chu Mu decided to continue diving. At present, the water avoidance bead could still resist for a while. He could only hope that the calling was not too far away. However, his current diving speed was much slower than before, and he was even more cautious. A mere opportunity might be able to bring him great benefits, but if he had to sacrifice his life for that opportunity, Chu Mu would not be willing to do so. If he lost his life, no matter how good the opportunity was, it would be of no use. Even without the opportunity, he could still cultivate and become stronger. Perhaps he would just have to spend more time and energy. He carefully observed the water avoidance bead's protective barrier. Once the protective barrier was severely damaged, he would immediately float up. The higher he went, the less pressure there would be. Naturally, the water avoidance bead would be safe and sound. As he dived down bit by bit, the calling became more and more intense. There was another cracking sound, which made Chu Mu's heart skip a beat. Suddenly, Chu Mu stopped. His gaze landed on something on the trench's wall. That thing was embedded in the trench's wall. Chu Mu did not know how deep the trench was. He had already dived down more than 1,000 meters, but he still could not see the bottom. Perhaps it was a few thousand meters deep, or perhaps it was tens of thousands of meters deep. There were already 5 cracks on the water avoidance bead, and the 6th crack had already appeared. If he dived any further, the 6th crack would definitely appear. However, Chu Mu did not need to dive any further, because he had found the thing that was calling him. It was embedded in the trench's wall. As he got closer, he could see a blur. It was a monument that was shaped like a sword. The monument was black, a deeper and darker black than the color of the trench. There was a black light lingering on the black sword monument, and it was covered with lines that crisscrossed densely. Seeing this black sword monument, Chu Mu's heart trembled. He felt that this sword monument was somewhat familiar, as if he had seen it somewhere before. However, Chu Mu was certain that he had never seen this sword monument before. "Is this really the dark sword monument?" Chu Mu said leisurely. The appearance of this black sword monument was extremely similar to the light sword monument owned by Xiaozhenkong. The lines on it also had a similar feeling. Chapter 14-15. On the surface of the blue sea, the seawater was a deep shade of blue. It was calm like a huge sapphire, but when the waves surged, it would become extremely terrifying and destroy everything. The sea could contain everything and also destroy everything. It was the cradle of civilization. On the blue sea, islands were scattered like stars in the sky. Nobody knew how many there were. The islands were big and small. Some of them were inhabited by life, while others were abandoned and uninhabited. They were not suitable for living, much less for normal cultivation. It had been a month and a few days since the Dark Shadow massacred 100,000 Shark Clan warriors. Previously, all the islands had been sealed off, making it difficult for flying ships to enter or leave. However, they could not seal off the islands for too long. Otherwise, it might cause a riot. The 4 suspicious Shark Clan high-level Saint-level contenders pursued Chu Mu. After being infuriated by Chu Mu, they entered the sea to investigate. Inadvertently, they let the others go. As for the humans and sea creatures who continued to search, they did not know that their appearances and auras had changed. They spread out and acted alone, blending into the crowd and becoming inconspicuous and even harder to find. The flying ships restarted and connected to the land. Merlin, Wenfei, and Dragonwing blended into different flying ships and headed inland. They were enslaved by Chu Mu. If Chu Mu was alive, they would also be alive. If Chu Mu died, the seeds planted in their minds would shatter and explode, severely injuring their minds and even causing them to die. They kept a low profile and tried their best not to attract attention, evading inspection time and time again. In the sea, the 4 Shark Clan high-level Saint-level contenders met again. "I didn't find him." "I didn't find him either." "That's impossible. How could a mere human escape our pursuit at the bottom of the sea?" "Let's work together and use the major sea exploring spell," the 4th said. "All right, let's work together." Immediately, the 4 Shark Clan high-level Saint-level contenders stood in 4 different directions. Their expressions were solemn as they waved their hands, causing the water around them to ripple. They used the sea exploring spell. Blue light gathered in the hands of the 4 Shark Clan high-level Saint-level contenders. It grew stronger and stronger, resonating with the surrounding seawater. Immediately, the 4 of them formed hand seals and pushed forward. 4 balls of light converged and merged into one before exploding, turning into a blue ripple that spread out at an indescribable speed. In the blink of an eye, it swept across a range of tens of thousands of meters and spread even further. The blue ripple spread not only in all directions but also up and down. The 4 Shark Clan high-level Saint-level contenders maintained their hand seals and pushed forward. Everything that the blue ripple passed would appear in their minds and be perceived by them. In an instant, the ripples of the Great Sea exploring technique swept across a range of more than 100,000 meters. Furthermore, it continued to spread even further, and also even deeper. Very quickly, the blue ripple passed through the narrow trench and went deep into the trench. In the blink of an eye, it reached where the Dark Sword Monument was, where Chu Mu was. When the blue ripple was about to pass by Chu Mu, there was a flash of black light from the Dark Sword Steel. The blue ripple directly passed through the Dark Sword Steel and Chu Mu, heading even further in. When the blue ripple expanded to its limit, it disappeared, as if it had disappeared into the sea. The 4 Shark Clan high-level Saint-level contenders all had ugly expressions because they had not discovered anything. When the blue ripple passed by Chu Mu, it was affected by the power of the Dark Sword Steel and directly passed through. As a result, the 4 Shark Clan high-level Saint-level experts were unable to sense it and missed it. Even the major sea exploring spell that the 4 of them had used together could not find any trace of Chu Mu. For a moment, the 4 of them had no idea what to do. They sank into their thoughts in anger. Chu Mu did not know about this. He had no idea that he had almost been sensed. If he had been sensed, it would have been difficult for him to escape. Inform the clan warriors to start a search in this sea region. I don't believe that a mere human can be faster than our sea race in the sea. He must have some kind of secret treasure to conceal his aura. That's right. Have a large group of warriors start a search. Don't miss a single spot. Apart from this person, there are 4 others. We can't let them go either. Immediately, the 4 Shark Clan high-level Saint-level experts used the unique method of the Shark Clan to communicate. After a while, a large group of Shark Clan warriors came from all directions to greet them. Then, they carried out their orders and started a detailed search of the sea region. As for the 4 Shark Clan high-level Saint-level experts, they left to search for the other 4. Even if they could not find Chu Mu, it would not be bad if they could capture the other 4. At the very least, they could use this opportunity to capture them one by one. Ordinary Shark Clan warriors, even high-level Shark Clan warriors, would not be able to penetrate more than 1,000 meters into the sea trench. Moreover, they would not have a treasure like the water avoidance pearl. Chu Mu was unaware of all that had happened because he was already attracted by the dark sword steel in front of him. As he approached, he could clearly feel the pure darkness aura emitted from the dark sword steel. It had existed since time immemorial. Just like when he was comprehending the light sword steel, his eyes were fixed on the dark sword steel. He stared at the patterns on the dark sword steel, eliminating all distracting thoughts and focusing his mind. In a flash, the dark sword steel disappeared. The patterns rapidly expanded and finally enveloped Chu Mu. Being in the darkness, he could not see anything. It was as if his eyes were blind. He could not see, he could not touch, he could only rely on his senses. The darkness was deep, the darkness was deep, the darkness was pure. Chu Mu could not help but think of the scene when he was comprehending the light sword steel. At that time, it was as if he had entered a world of pure light. There was only light and nothing else. Now that he was in the darkness, Chu Mu had a feeling that this darkness was similar to light. They were both so pure, so deep, so domineering. Light and darkness were opposites. Just like water and fire, they were even more absolute than the opposites of water and fire. Where there was light, there would be no darkness. Where there was darkness, there would be no light. Light and darkness could not coexist. This was common knowledge. If one studied it more deeply, they would understand that light and darkness were essentially the same. Wandering in the darkness, he couldn't see, hear, or even smell. However, Chu Mu had a feeling that gradually, he seemed to merge with the darkness, becoming a part of it. He became a tiny particle in the darkness, bobbing up and down in the ocean of darkness. The divine light will in his spiritual world emitted a strange fluctuation. Waves of bright light bloomed, illuminating the entire spiritual world. It also filled the entire spiritual world, containing all the power. It also seemed to assimilate all the power. It stuck close to the barrier of the spiritual world, forming a barrier of light. Endless darkness and power wanted to enter Chu Mu's spiritual world, but it was blocked by the barrier of light set up by the divine light will. It could not enter at all. The two sides resisted, and the divine light will in his spiritual world shone brightly. Darkness and light could not coexist. Under normal circumstances, the power of darkness and the power of light would definitely cause a great conflict in such a situation. However, Chu Mu was keenly aware that the confrontation between the power of darkness and the divine light will was not as intense as he had imagined. It seemed very intense, but there was no determination to determine life and death. The darkness was endless. There was no beginning or end. Chu Mu was immersed in an epiphany. Darkness, black, pure black. It cannot tolerate other colors. This means that it is very domineering. It cannot tolerate other powers. It is like night descending and covering the world. Everything in the world is enveloped in darkness. It will not disappear, but it will be submerged in the darkness, moving at the same pace as the darkness. In other words, in addition to being domineering, darkness also has the characteristic of tolerance. Darkness can tolerate everything except for light. Once light appears, either darkness retreats or light is extinguished. Light is also very domineering. Everywhere it passes, it covers everything. It cannot tolerate other colors, and only pure light is left. However, other things can exist in the light. Just like the day, wherever it goes, light will appear. Therefore, in essence, light and darkness have something in common. They are equally domineering and equally tolerant. Under the epiphany, traces of understanding appeared. Chu Mu gradually understood something. It was an indescribable mystery. With a thought, the tyrannical power of divine sense combined with sword will try to suppress the divine light will and attract the power of darkness into his spiritual world. However, the power of the divine light will was too strong. No matter how much force Chu Mu exerted, it was difficult to suppress it. Instead, there was a kind of momentum that made him stronger. After resisting for a period of time, he was still unable to suppress the divine light will and cause the power of darkness to enter his spiritual world. Helpless, Chu Mu could only temporarily give up. Thinking back to the process of obtaining the divine light will, Chu Mu did not comprehend the divine light will on his own. Instead, he obtained the divine light will by chance. At that time, he obtained the divine light will because he was undergoing nirvana beside the light sword steel. When his soul underwent nirvana, the calamity was too strong and almost caused his consciousness to sink. It was the support of the light sword steel that strengthened Chu Mu's consciousness and prevented it from being extinguished. Therefore, he also obtained the divine light will. Could it be that I have to undergo nirvana again to obtain the divine light will? Chu Mu thought to himself. He did not know what benefits obtaining the divine light will would bring him, but he had a feeling that obtaining the divine light will would definitely bring him great benefits. The light sword steel was right in front of him. If he missed it, he would be a fool. He had to seize this opportunity. However, if he underwent nirvana, there would be a huge fluctuation and his location would be exposed. How should he choose? After a moment of hesitation and thought, Chu Mu made a decision. If he had not discovered the light sword steel, it would have been fine. However, since he had discovered it, it was his opportunity, and he had to seize it. Breakthrough. Chapter 14:16. At the bottom of the deep sea, silhouettes were rapidly cruising around. They were like bolts of lightning, shuttling back and forth silently. The great army of the Shark Clan's warriors crisscrossed the entire seabed. They were so dense that there was no room to escape. Some Shark Clan warriors had also entered the narrow trench, but with their strength, they were unable to reach a depth of 1,000 meters. The pressure was too great for them to bear, so they were unable to find Chu Mu. More than 1,000 meters below the narrow trench, the dark sword steel shone with a profound and endless black light. Chu Mu was in front of the dark sword steel. The protective barrier of the water avoidance pearl had unknowingly disappeared, and his entire body was wrapped in a layer of dark light, completely invisible. At this time, a figure rapidly dove down like a bolt of lightning. Soon, it passed by the dark sword steel, but it did not discover anything. Because the fluctuations of the dark sword steel were completely concealed, it could not be sensed. After diving more than 1,000 meters, it did not discover anything. The pressure was too great to bear, so it could only dive up, passing by Chu Mu once again. The darkness was endless, with no end in sight. Everything was like nothingness, but everything was so pure. Experiencing the fluctuations of the power of darkness, his comprehension gradually deepened. However, he was still unable to guide the power of darkness into his spiritual world, because the divine will of light was too tyrannical. Chu Mu once again took out the spirit pool. When Shadow appeared, he had killed 100,000 Shark Clan warriors and collected the spatial rings of several hundred Shark Clan saints. His wealth had suddenly increased by several times, and he had a large number of treasures. He took out a portion of them and placed them into the spirit pool, where they were refined by the spirit pool's power, turning into pure spirit energy. It had to be said that Chu Mu's luck was pretty good. If he had taken out the spirit pool earlier, the fluctuations of spirit energy would have been discovered by the Shark Clan saint. All the treasures had been turned into spirit energy. Chu Mu threw himself into the spirit pool and sat cross-legged, absorbing the pure spirit energy in the spirit pool. He divided it into two parts. One part was used to cultivate the astral calamity body refining technique, and the other part was used to cultivate the divine desolate sword art. Chi refining and body refining went hand in hand. his early 7th heavenly layer cultivation base began to rapidly rise. It was as if the sound of flowing water and wind could be heard beside his ears. The whooshing sound was incessant. Pure spirit energy constantly poured into his body, and it was divided into two parts, chi refining and body refining. This caused Chu Mu's chi cultivation base to rapidly rise. Middle 7th heavenly layer. The increase of a small realm caused Chu Mu's divine desolate sword energy to become even denser and his physique to become even stronger. Of spirit energy and spirit for Chu Mu. Of it. Level up, level up, level up, level up without end. His cultivation base was getting deeper and deeper. As Chu Mu worked hard to raise his cultivation base, the Shark clan members were about to go crazy. More than a month had passed. The Shark clan and their subordinate clans had all been mobilized, and they had even forced the human sex to search everywhere. They had covered every inch of the island, but not only were they unable to find the person who could use the Black Sword domain, they also couldn't find the other 5. It wasn't that they couldn't find the other 5. At the very least, they had found the whereabouts of one of them. However, that person was only at the Nirvana realm, yet he had hidden himself in the sea. Even after the Shark clan sent out a large number of warriors to search the sea, they still couldn't find a trace of him. The sea was the world of the sea race. Especially for a powerful race like the Shark clan, they were one of the overlords of the sea. Even so, they couldn't do anything to a mere Nirvana realm human. This was a disgrace, a great disgrace. If this news were to spread to the ears of the other sea race, the Shark clan would likely become a laughingstock. In the Shark clan's headquarters, there were already elders who suggested inviting old ancestor Emperor Shark. But there were also elders who objected. They felt that inviting old ancestor Emperor Shark would only make them feel incompetent. Chu Mu didn't know about any of this. Even if he knew, he wouldn't care. At most, he would just laugh it off. He constantly absorbed spiritual energy to cultivate. His cultivation had already reached the late 7th heavenly layer and was beginning to consolidate. Black light spread out from the dark sword steel, enveloping Chu Mu. It greatly weakened the spiritual energy fluctuations in the pool, making it difficult for them to spread out. Time passed bit by bit. Finally, Chu Mu's cultivation reached the peak of the 7th heavenly layer and was pushing towards the limit. When the spiritual energy in the pool was almost exhausted, Chu Mu's cultivation had finally reached the limit of the 7th heavenly layer. It was difficult for him to advance any further. He could only break through and undergo nirvana. He sat cross-legged in the pool and took out a large amount of nirvana chi. Originally, after undergoing the 7th nirvana, Chu Mu's nirvana chi was almost exhausted. He couldn't undergo the 8th nirvana. However, there was a lot of nirvana chi stored in the spatial rings of the dead Shark clan saint. It was enough for Chu Mu to undergo the 8th nirvana. Chu Mu's foundation was far superior to ordinary cultivators of the same level. The amount of nirvana chi he needed to undergo each nirvana was also far greater than ordinary cultivators of the same level. In addition, he had a cultivation in the aspect of body transformation, which was equal to chi cultivation. A single nirvana was equivalent to nirvana in both chi cultivation and body transformation. The amount of nirvana chi he needed was not as simple as doubling his cultivation. A large amount of nirvana chi appeared, piercing through Chu Mu's incomparably strong body like sharp swords. Waves of intense pain surged through his body, but Chu Mu's expression didn't change. It was as if his soul had left his body. He already had a very good resistance to this kind of pain. However, the physique of a 7th heavenly layer nirvana was much stronger than that of a 6th heavenly layer nirvana layer. The amount of nirvana chi needed to be torn apart was much greater. His tyrannical body was torn apart. His flesh and blood were smashed into a ball. Then, his dantian was also torn apart. The remaining nirvana chi rushed into Chu Mu's spiritual world. During the low and middle stages of nirvana, it was the body and dantian that underwent nirvana. It had no effect on the spiritual world. Only during the high stages of nirvana would one undergo nirvana on the spiritual level and soul. During the seventh nirvana, Chu Mu had already undergone a soul nirvana. He had experienced it once, so it wasn't that unfamiliar to him. Under the impact of the nirvana chi, his spiritual world began to be penetrated. One hole after another, it shattered and collapsed. The nirvana chi was like a sword, as if 10,000 swords had returned to their origin. They stabbed towards Chu Mu's soul. After undergoing nirvana, his soul was even more resilient. It resisted the piercing of the nirvana chi, but it also caused Chu Mu to suffer even more pain. The pain was more than 10 times more intense than the pain he experienced during the seventh nirvana. The flames of consciousness that had been tempered by the divine will of light stubbornly resisted and were not extinguished. However, the intense pain was magnified and extended several times. It was even more unbearable. It was better to die. The divine will of light didn't shatter. Instead, it shrunk into a single point. The bright light shone brightly. The light illuminated Chu Mu's consciousness. It was incomparably painful, but he stubbornly held on. It was unknown whether it was attracted by Chu Mu's soul or the ripples of the divine will of light, but the dark sword steel suddenly erupted with black light. With a buzzing sound, the runes on the sword steel lit up one by one. They left the dark sword steel like a projection and flew towards Chu Mu's soul. One by one, the runes on the dark sword steel fused into Chu Mu's soul. The divine will of light's light became even brighter and more intense. It was like a small sun that illuminated the world. It affected the runes on the dark sword steel and made it difficult for them to get close. The dark sword steel suddenly trembled. Black light filled the air. The runes on the dark sword steel seemed to have received the support of power. They became even more tyrannical. Like swords, they tore through the divine will of light and entered Chu Mu's consciousness. Suddenly, a dot of black light appeared. It expanded and formed a black ray of light. It gradually grew stronger and stronger, like a dark sun. The two small suns of light and darkness resonated with each other. Their powers opposed each other and formed a balance. They were evenly matched. The fusion of the divine will of darkness caused Chu Mu's consciousness to become even more powerful. His resistance to pain increased tremendously. His soul finally shattered completely. The divine will of light and divine will of darkness each occupied one side, protecting Chu Mu's consciousness from being extinguished. The consciousness burned brightly, allowing Chu Mu to maintain a high level of clarity. The divine will of light and divine will of darkness tempered Chu Mu's consciousness again and again. They entered his soul and tempered it, causing it to become purer and more condensed. As the strength of his soul increased, so did his comprehension and other abilities that were directly related to his soul. In the outside world, several thousand meters away from the dark sword steel, many Sea Tribe warriors cruised past. In the air, there were also Sea Tribe warriors flying past. Both the sky and the ground were sealed. At this time, even higher up, several thousand meters away from the sea, the sound of wind began to howl. It came from all directions. Wisps of white mist drifted in from all directions. They quickly condensed and twisted into streaks. They were like white flood dragons that snaked over from all directions, turning the sky into an ocean. What dense yuan qi of heaven and earth! Many Sea Tribe warriors were alarmed. They all raised their heads to look at the sky in shock. Wind and clouds gathered, and the yuan qi was extremely dense. The undulations were extremely shocking. Even saint experts would be moved. What's going on? What's going on? Is a treasure about to appear in the sea? The appearance of a treasure would often be accompanied by a phenomenon. Such dense yuan qi of heaven and earth could be considered a phenomenon. No, this is definitely not a phenomenon caused by a treasure. Someone is breaking through and undergoing nirvana. It's a human. It must be that human. He's still in this region of the sea. What an arrogant human! Instead of hiding in the ground, he actually dares to undergo nirvana here. He's courting death. Looking at the yuan qi of heaven and earth, it means that this human's foundation is extremely deep and his talent is shocking. He's definitely one of the top geniuses of the human race. Find him and capture him alive. With the intense yuan qi of heaven and earth as a guide, the Shark Tribe warriors immediately found a target. They were like ships sailing on the vast sea that had seen a beacon. They all gathered from all directions,